The Montana Territory, 1885, a land where justice often came from the barrel of a gun rather than the gavel of a judge. But perhaps no secret was better kept than the true identity of Martha Wilkins, the quiet widow who ran the Whispering Pines. In at the edge of Elk Valley. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The locals knew her as a mild-mannered woman with silver-streaked chestnut hair and hands that could bake the territory's finest apple pies. What they didn't know was that those same hands had once been the steadiest in the West, belonging to Deadeye Mary Mason, the legendary exhibition sharpshooter whose accuracy had amazed crowds from St. Louis to San Francisco. 10 years had passed since Mary vanished from the spotlight after a shooting competition in Chicago ended in tragedy. Most believed she had died in the Great River Fire that claimed several lives that night. None suspected she was serving coffee and fresh-baked biscuits to weary travelers, building a quiet life far removed from her fame and the dark secrets that drove her into hiding. But fate has a way of finding those who wish to remain hidden. The arrival of the notorious Blackwell gang would soon force Martha to decide whether some secrets were worth dying to protect or worth killing to keep. Elk Valley wasn't much to look at in the summer of 1885. Just a scattered collection of weathered buildings huddled against the relentless Montana sun. The town had sprung up around a natural hot spring that native tribes had long considered sacred, though there was nothing particularly holy about the mix of ranchers, miners, and drifters who now called it home. It was the kind of place most folks just passed through and promptly forgot, which was exactly why Martha Wilkins had chosen it. The Whispering Pines Inn stood apart from Main Street, a 2-story log structure surrounded by a carefully tended garden where herbs and vegetables thrived despite the harsh climate. Martha had purchased the property 6 years earlier from a discouraged missionary for a handful of gold coins that no one thought to question. She'd transformed the former chapel into a respectable establishment, known for its clean rooms, good food, and the proprietor's uncanny ability to calm even the rowdiest guest with nothing more than a steady gaze and a gentle word. "More coffee, Mr. Sullivan?" Martha's voice carried its usual warmth as she approached a table where the local livery owner sat nursing his morning brew. Her silver-streaked chestnut hair was neatly pinned back. Her dress, simple but well-made, every inch the respectable widow she appeared to be. "Thank you kindly, Mrs. Wilkins." Daniel Sullivan offered a tired smile as she refilled his cup. Like most of the townspeople, he'd grown fond of the widow since her arrival. "Hear about the trouble over in Silver Creek?" Martha's hands remained steady as she poured, though something flickered behind her hazel eyes. "I try not to pay much attention to gossip, Mr. Sullivan. Ain't gossip this time. The Blackwell gang hit the bank there yesterday, killing 2 people including the bank manager." He shook his head grimly. "Word is, they're moving this way. Sheriff Henderson's organizing a defense, but..." He trailed off. "But Silver Creek had a bank manager too," Martha finished softly. She set the coffee pot down with deliberate care, her movements precise in a way that might have seemed odd to a more observant witness. "Well, I suppose we'll all need to be extra cautious until they're caught." What Daniel didn't notice, what none of them noticed, was how Martha's right hand briefly brushed the small silver brooch at her collar, a gesture that had nothing to do with widow's grief and everything to do with muscle memory. The brooch's pin was honed to a sharpness that could slice through rope in an emergency, just as the modest ring on her finger could be adjusted to hold a small compass. Tools that had served her well in her former life on the exhibition circuit, where precise timing and orientation under the bright lights of the big tent had been essential. The breakfast crowd slowly thinned as the sun climbed higher, locals heading to their daily labors, while the few overnight guests set out for distant destinations. Martha moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency, cleaning tables, kneading bread dough, checking in on old Mrs. Jenkins, who helped with the laundry. But beneath the domestic tranquility, her mind was working with strategic precision. The Blackwell gang. She'd heard of them, of course, led by three brothers, James, Henry, and young Louis Blackwell. They were exactly the kind of brutal, undisciplined thugs she'd always despised. Even in her sharpshooting days, Mary Mason had been different. She'd been a professional who lived by a code, never endangering innocence, never showing off with reckless shooting, never using her skills for anything but entertainment and honest competition. The Blackwells were rabid dogs by comparison. Mrs. Wilkins, a voice pulled her from her thoughts. Emily Carson, who ran the general store, stood in the doorway, looking concerned. "Got a moment?" Martha wiped her hands on her apron, offering her usual gentle smile. "Of course, Emily, come in. I just took a fresh loaf from the oven." The younger woman followed her to the kitchen, but declined the offered bread. "It's about the Blackwells. Sheriff Henderson is calling a town meeting tonight. He wants everyone there, especially," she hesitated, "especially women living alone. Don't worry about me, dear. I've managed quite well on my own these past years." Martha's voice held a hint of amusement. Emily shifted uncomfortably. "It's not just that. There's rumors about them, about what they do to women in the towns they raid. And you out here alone." "The Lord provides," Martha replied softly. The irony of using her cover story's piety lost on her visitor. In truth, the Lord had very little to do with the shotgun hidden beneath the front counter or the derringer strapped to her thigh. "But I appreciate your concern." After Emily left, Martha stood at her kitchen window, watching heat waves distort the landscape. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar motion of kneading dough, while her mind catalogued resources and options. The inn's position on the outskirts of town, once chosen for privacy, now presented tactical challenges. The second floor offered good sightlines, but the surrounding terrain provided too much cover for potential attackers. She had weapons cached throughout the building, but not nearly the arsenal she'd once commanded during her touring days with Colt's sponsorship. Most troubling was the question of exposure. A confrontation with the Blackwells would draw attention she couldn't afford. Deadeye Mary might be considered dead by most, but there were still substantial rewards offered by rival shooting companies who claimed she'd stolen proprietary techniques before disappearing. All it would take was one person making the connection. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention. Through the wavering heat, she spotted three riders approaching from the East Trail, worn men with the hard eyes and casual alertness that marked them as something more dangerous than simple travelers. Not the Blackwells themselves, but likely scouts testing the town's defenses. Martha adjusted her apron, touched the brooch at her collar, and prepared to greet her guests with the perfect blend of maternal concern and mild timidity that had become her armor. But beneath the widow's gentle facade, Deadeye Mary was awakening from her long slumber, ready to prove that the most dangerous predator is often the one hiding in plain sight. As she moved to open the door, a wry smile touched her lips. She'd spent 10 years building this peaceful life, walking away from fame and fortune to seek something quieter. But she hadn't survived this long by being naive. Sometimes the past rides up to your door no matter how far you run, and when it does, you better be ready to either serve it tea or put it in the ground. The bell above the door chimed as the first rider dismounted. Martha Wilkins smoothed her apron and prepared to welcome them with a widow's smile. But it was Mary Mason, the legendary Deadeye, who began calculating angles of attack and planning for the blood that would soon stain the valley floor. The game was about to begin, and she intended to be the only one left standing when it ended. The three men who dismounted in front of the Whispering Pines Inn bore the dust of long travel, but Martha's practiced eye noted details others might. Miss. Their horses were well cared for despite the trail grime. Smart riders who knew the value of good mounts. Their guns were worn in their holsters with the comfortable familiarity of men who used them often. Most telling was their positioning as they approached, unconsciously spreading out to cover all angles, a habit born of years of violent experience. "Welcome to the Whispering Pines, gentlemen," Martha called out, pitching her voice with just the right note of matronly welcome. "You look like you could use a good meal and some rest." The leader, a weathered man with a jagged scar bisecting his left eyebrow, touched his hat brim. "Much obliged, ma'am. Name's Wilson. These are my associates, Mr. Fuller and Mr. Doyle." Martha noted how he offered no first names, and how his companions kept their hands close to their weapons, even as they nodded in greeting. She'd used similar tactics herself in the old days, when scouting venues for her shooting exhibitions, assessing crowds for troublemakers or rival performers who might try to sabotage her act. "Please come in out of the heat," she gestured toward the door. "I've fresh coffee brewing and stew on the stove." Her keen eyes didn't miss how Wilson positioned himself to keep both her and his men in view as they entered, or how Fuller lingered, slightly behind to watch their backs. Inside, she seated them at a corner table, the one they would have chosen anyway, with clear views of both the door and the windows. As she brought coffee and bowls of steaming stew, their eyes roamed the room with professional assessment, taking in exits and potential cover. Martha moved with deliberate, unhurried grace, playing her role to perfection while her mind catalogued every detail about her dangerous guests. "Don't get many travelers out this way," she commented mildly as she poured their coffee. "Business or pleasure brings you to our little town?" "Bit of both, ma'am," Wilson replied, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Heard there might be opportunities in these parts." "Not much opportunity in Elk Valley, I'm afraid." Martha sighed, layering her voice with just the right touch of wistful resignation. "Most folks just pass through on their way to somewhere else." "That's so." Doyle spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a Texas drawl. "Seems like a nice, quiet place. Good place for folks who want to avoid complications." The implied threat was subtle, but clear. Martha allowed a flicker of nervous confusion to cross her face, just what they'd expect from a simple widow. "Well, we do our best to keep to ourselves out here. Not much excitement, thank the Lord." She turned away to fetch more coffee, using the movement to conceal how her right hand briefly brushed the derringer hidden in her skirt folds. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. In her sharpshooting days, she'd have already marked these men for what they were. Advanced scouts for the Blackwell gang, sent to assess the town's defenses and identify potential problems. Deadeye Mary hadn't suffered threats lightly, but she wasn't that person anymore, or at least she couldn't appear to be. The men ate quietly, speaking little but watching much. Martha maintained her gentle efficiency, keeping their coffee cups full while seemingly oblivious to their scrutiny, but her mind was racing, evaluating options and planning contingencies. These men were definitely Blackwell gang scouts, and their presence meant the main force wasn't far behind. Through the window, she spotted Emily Carson hurrying past, casting worried glances at the strangers' horses. The young shopkeeper's concern was touching, if naive. The real danger wasn't to Martha, it was to anyone who got in her way if she was forced to resurrect Deadeye Mary. As she refilled Wilson's cup, he caught her wrist in a grip just tight enough to send a message. "Tell me something." "Mrs. Wilkins," she supplied, allowing a tremor of fear to enter her voice. "Mrs. Wilkins, women running a place like this alone must have some protection. A husband nearby, maybe, or some men who look out for you." She pulled her wrist free with carefully portrayed timidity. "I get by with the Lord's help, Mr. Wilson, and the good people of the town look after their own." Fuller, who had been silent. Until now, gave a low chuckle. "Lord's help won't count for much when real trouble comes calling, ma'am." Martha stepped back, clutching her coffee pot like a shield. I should check on the bread in the oven. Please excuse me." In the kitchen, she allowed herself a moment of cold anger. The threat had been crude, lacking the finesse she'd demanded from her own assistants back in the day. The Blackwell gang clearly recruited for brutality rather than intelligence. It would make them dangerous, yes, but also predictable. Through the kitchen window, she spotted Sheriff Henderson riding toward the inn, likely drawn by reports of strange riders. His arrival would force her visitors to maintain their harmless traveler facade a while longer. Good. She needed time to prepare. Moving to the pantry, she quickly lifted a loose floorboard and retrieved a small key. The locked trunk in her bedroom held more than just widow's weeds. Guns, ammunition, and the tools of her former trade waited within. She hadn't touched them in years, had prayed she'd never need to again, but as she heard the sheriff's boots on her porch, she knew her peaceful facade was about to be tested. Martha Wilkins had spent 10 years building a life of quiet redemption, but Deadeye Mary had spent 15 years surviving by her wits and her aim. As she smoothed her apron and prepared to return to her guests, she wondered which woman would be serving breakfast tomorrow, and which of her visitors would be alive to eat it. Sheriff Levi Henderson wasn't a man easily rattled, but something about the 3 strangers in Martha Wilkins's inn set his teeth on edge. 20 years wearing a badge had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every one of them was screaming danger. "Afternoon, Mrs. Wilkins," he called out as he entered, noting how the 3 men tensed slightly at his arrival. Thought, "I'd stop by and check on things." Martha emerged from the kitchen, her face a perfect mask of gentle welcome. "Sheriff Henderson, what a pleasant surprise. Coffee? Don't mind if I do." He settled his tall frame into a chair near the stranger's table, positioning himself to keep all 3 men in view. The scarred one, Wilson, met his gaze with calculated neutrality. "Just passing through, Sheriff," Wilson offered without being asked. "Fine establishment Mrs. Wilkins runs here." Henderson nodded slowly, accepting the coffee Martha poured. "That it is. We're mighty proud of our Mrs. Wilkins." His emphasis on "our" was subtle but clear. "Town's been quiet lately, planning to keep it that way." The warning in his voice was unmistakable. Martha, moving between tables with practiced grace, felt a complex mix of emotions. Henderson was a good man, trying to protect what he saw as a vulnerable widow. If he only knew she'd once hit 9 airborne targets in succession while riding a galloping horse, a feat that had made her the talk of the Western Territories. "More coffee, Mr. Wilson?" she asked, maintaining her role perfectly. Her hands remained steady as she poured, though her mind was racing through scenarios and contingencies. The timing of Henderson's arrival was both helpful and complicated. His presence would keep the scouts in check, but it also meant more witnesses if things went wrong. "Thank you kindly, ma'am." Wilson's politeness had taken on a strained edge. "My friends and I were just discussing moving on soon. Got business further west." "So soon?" Martha allowed just the right note of disappointed hospitality to color her voice. "I was about to take fresh bread from the oven." The conversation was a dance of hidden meanings and veiled threats, reminiscent of the diplomatic maneuvering she'd once conducted with rival shooting shows competing for the same venues. But where Deadeye Mary would have met such challenges. With subtle displays of skill, Martha Wilkins could only offer coffee and concerned glances. Through her window, she spotted Emily Carson speaking animatedly with Daniel Sullivan outside the livery. Word of the strangers was spreading through town, and with it the tension that preceded violence. She'd seen it before in countless small towns across the exhibition circuit. Fear had a way of turning neighbors into either allies or obstacles. "Mrs. Wilkins," Sheriff Henderson's voice drew her attention back. "Might I have a word in private?" She nodded, leading him to the kitchen while the 3 visitors exchanged meaningful looks. The kitchen's heavy log walls would muffle conversation, but she positioned herself where she could still watch the dining room through the serving window. "Those men," Henderson began without preamble, keeping his voice low. "They trouble you?" Martha allowed a slight tremor to enter her voice. "Not directly, Sheriff, but something about them." "Yeah." His weathered face creased with concern. "Got word this morning. Blackwell's gang hit 3 ranches outside Silver Creek after the bank. Bad business. Real bad. She didn't have to fake her shudder. She'd heard stories about the Blackwells' treatment of isolated homesteads. Even in her exhibition days, she'd put down a man who showed such proclivities, a drunk who'd tried to force himself on one of the costume girls. She'd aimed her pistol at the ground between his feet, the shot so precise it had cut his boot. Lace without touching leather. Sometimes fear was a more effective teacher than pain. You think these men... She left the question hanging. Can't prove anything yet. But they fit the description of Blackwell's advanced scouts. Henderson's hand unconsciously touched his gun belt. "I've sent for help from the territorial marshal, but it'll be days before they arrive." "I'll be fine, Sheriff," she injected warm confidence into her voice. "The Lord watches over his flock." Henderson looked unconvinced. "Lord might need some mortal assistance on this one, ma'am. I'd feel better if you stayed in town until this blows over. Emily Carson has a spare room." "This is my home," she said firmly, allowing some of her true steel to show through the widow's facade. "I won't be driven from it by fear." Something in her tone made Henderson give her a sharp look, but before he could respond, a commotion erupted from the dining room. Fuller's voice carried clearly, "Might want to learn some manners, boy." They rushed back to find Fuller standing over young Michael Carson, Emily's 16-year-old brother. The boy had apparently entered with a delivery from the general store and gotten too close to the stranger's table. "Is there a problem, gentlemen?" Henderson's voice carried the weight of his authority. Wilson waved a dismissive hand. "Just a misunderstanding, Sheriff. Boy here startled my friend." Michael scrambled to his feet, face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Martha spotted the slight bulge under Fuller's coat that suggested he'd been about to draw his weapon on the boy. Dead-eye Mary would have killed him for such poor impulse. "Control." Martha Wilkins could only watch with carefully concealed contempt. "Michael," she said gently, "why don't you help me with these supplies? Sheriff, would you see these gentlemen settle their bill?" It was a diplomatic solution that gave everyone a graceful exit. As she led Michael to the kitchen, she heard Wilson and his men preparing to leave, their attempt to scout the town compromised by Fuller's poor judgment. They'd report back to the Blackwells, and soon the real trouble would begin. "You all right, Michael?" she asked, checking him for injuries. The teenage boy nodded, though his hands were shaking slightly. "I don't like them, Mrs. Wilkins. The way they looked at you when the sheriff wasn't watching." Her heart softened. In her years running the inn, she'd become genuinely fond of the Carson siblings. Emily's friendship and Michael's earnest help had been bright spots in her carefully constructed new life. The thought of the Blackwells threatening them stirred something dangerous in her soul. "Sometimes men mistake kindness for weakness," she told him, unconsciously echoing words she'd once used when teaching young women to protect themselves on the road. But the Lord has ways of protecting his own. After everyone had gone, the scouts riding east despite their claimed western business, Henderson returned to town with clear reluctance. Martha began her preparations. The trunk in her bedroom yielded familiar treasures, a matched pair of Colt revolvers, their grips inlaid with pearl and worn smooth by years of use, a Winchester rifle with custom sights that had been specially made for her exhibition work, ammunition, gun oil, and the tools of her former trade. As she worked, muscle memory took over. Her hands remembered the rhythms of cleaning and loading, the precise movements that had once made her legend. Deadeye Mary had been more than just a sharpshooter. She'd been a symbol of precision and professionalism in a world of showmanship and spectacle. Her exhibitions had been feared not for flashy tricks, but for surgical accuracy. She'd once shot a playing card edge-on at 50 paces, splitting it perfectly down the middle. A knock at the door made her quickly hide the weapons. Emily Carson entered, carrying a basket of fresh vegetables. "Mrs. Wilkins, I brought you some. Are you all right? You look just tired, dear." Martha forced a smile. "It's been an eventful day." Emily sat down in her basket, wringing her hands nervously. "The whole town's talking. Those men, the Blackwell gang. Sheriff Henderson called another meeting tonight. I heard. I'll be there." Martha began putting away the vegetables, using the movement to conceal how her mind was already plotting defensive positions and fields of fire. The inn's position on the outskirts had tactical advantages she hadn't considered when buying it. Good sightlines to the approach roads, elevated ground that commanded the surrounding terrain. "You should come stay with us," Emily pressed. "Please, after what happened with Michael." "I'll be fine." Martha touched the younger woman's shoulder reassuringly. "You focus on keeping your brother safe. These troubled times will pass." But as Emily left, Martha knew the time for passive waiting was ending. The Blackwell gang wouldn't be content just to rob the bank. They'd want to make an example of the town, establish their reputation through terror and blood. It was a crude strategy she'd seen too many times before. Standing at her window, watching the sun paint the valley gold, Martha Wilkins felt the last decade of peaceful existence beginning to crack. She built this life carefully, brick by brick, relationship by relationship. She'd found a kind of redemption in serving others rather than entertaining them, in nurturing rather than amazing crowds with displays of skill. But as the shadows lengthened across her carefully tended garden, she felt Deadeye Mary stirring to life in her soul. The question was no longer whether her past would resurface, but how many would die when it did. She touched the brooch at her throat, remembering the weight of fame and the price of perfection. "God forgive me," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was asking forgiveness for her past actions or for the ones she was about to commit. The sun sank behind the mountains, and in the growing darkness, Martha Wilkins began to fade away, leaving only the deadly precision of Deadeye Mary. Later, that evening, as she prepared for the town meeting, Martha heard horses approaching. Her hand instinctively moved to the derringer hidden in her skirts, but it was only Dr. Abigail Wright, the town's physician, riding up with her medical bag. "Evening, Martha," the doctor called out, dismounting with the ease of someone who spent more time on horseback than in an office. "Thought I'd check on you before the meeting." Martha relaxed slightly. Abigail Wright was perhaps the closest thing she had to a true friend in Elk Valley. The doctor was a woman who understood the need for reinvention. She'd arrived 4 years ago with her own secrets, though Martha suspected they had more to do with a failed career in Philadelphia than a criminal past. "Come in, Abigail. I just made fresh tea." In the kitchen, the two women shared a quiet moment as the last light faded outside. Abigail's keen eyes studied Martha's face. "You're preparing for trouble." It wasn't a question. Martha poured tea with steady hands. "A woman in my position must always be prepared." "A woman in your position," Abigail repeated softly. "You know, in 4 years, you've never once mentioned what position that was before you came here." Martha met her friend's gaze evenly. "Some pasts are better left buried, Abigail. Like those guns you think I haven't noticed." When Martha tensed, Abigail waved a dismissive hand. "Please, I was an army surgeon before coming west. I know the calluses that come from regular shooting. Your hands might look like a baker's now, but they tell a different story." It was a reminder that Martha wasn't the only one in town with observational skills. "Does that concern you, Doctor?" What concerns me is keeping my friends alive. Abigail's voice hardened. I treated survivors. From the Blackwell gang's last raid, what they did to those people, she shuddered. Whatever's in your past, Martha, I suspect we might need it in our future. The simple acceptance in her friend's voice touched something deep in Martha's soul. Deadeye Mary had never had true friends, only admirers, subordinates, and rivals. Perhaps that was why leaving that life behind had been both necessary and terrifically hard. Before she could respond, more riders approached, Sheriff Henderson with Deputy Reynolds and 3 other men Martha recognized. Thomas Grant, who owned the largest ranch outside town, Marcus Fletcher, who ran the Elk Valley Telegraph, and old Jacob Turner, who'd once been a cavalry scout, all capable men, all armed. Mrs. Wilkins, Henderson called out, might I have a word before the meeting? In her parlor, the men stood awkwardly while Abigail Wright leaned against the wall, clearly having no intention of leaving. Martha served coffee, playing the proper hostess, while her mind assessed each man's potential usefulness in the coming conflict. Ma'am, Henderson began, we've been discussing the town's defense. You're in, well, it's the first building. Raiders would come too, and the most defensible, Turner cut in. Begging your pardon, Mrs. Wilkins, but I was a scout for 12 years. This position, with the right preparation and the right people, you want to garrison men here, Martha finished for him. The idea had merit from a tactical perspective, but it also presented complications. Armed men in her inn would make it harder to conceal her own preparations. 4 men at least, Henderson nodded. Good shots, reliable men. They can stay out of your way, just provide protection if— No! The word came out sharper than Martha intended, carrying an echo of command that made the men blink in surprise. She softened her tone quickly. I appreciate the offer, Sheriff, but I couldn't impose. Besides, the town needs its defenders concentrated, where they can protect the most people. Martha, Abigail interrupted, don't be stubborn. This isn't about pride. It's about survival. But it wasn't pride that made Martha refuse. It was practicality. The coming fight would require Deadeye Mary's skills, and those couldn't be deployed with witnesses present. Better to be thought stubborn than to risk exposure. I have my reasons, she said firmly. Now, shouldn't we be heading to the meeting? As they rode into town, Martha having finally accepted Abigail's insistence on escorting her, she noted how the atmosphere had changed since morning. Doors were barred, windows shuttered, armed men stood watch on rooftops. Fear had transformed the peaceful town into an armed camp. The meeting hall was packed, the air thick with tension and tobacco smoke. Martha took a seat near the back, observing the crowd with professional interest. She saw fear, yes, but also determination. These people had built lives here. They wouldn't give them up easily. Emily Carson hurried over, Michael trailing behind. The boy's earlier bravado had been replaced by quiet anger. Mrs. Wilkins, you came. I was worried you'd stay out at the inn alone. Martha smiled, though her eyes were scanning the crowd, marking positions, evaluating threats and assets, just as she had in her exhibition days. Some habits never died. Sheriff Henderson called the meeting to order, laying out what they knew of the Blackwell gang's movements. Martha listened with half an ear, more interested in the townspeople's reactions. She noted who showed fear, who showed courage, who tried to hide their true feelings. In her experience, knowing people's breaking points was as important as knowing their strengths. As the meeting progressed, she made her decision. Deadeye Mary couldn't return publicly. That identity had to remain buried. But perhaps there was a middle path, a way to use her skills and experience without revealing their source. She'd need to be subtle, work through others, guide without, seeming to lead. Looking around the room at these people who had accepted her, trusted her, made her part of their community, Martha felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Not the brutal weight of fame and expectation, but something deeper, more meaningful. These people weren't her audience to dazzle, they were her neighbors to protect. The meeting ended with plans for watches, defensive positions, and evacuation routes. As people filed out into the night, Martha felt Abigail's hand on her arm. "You're not going back to the inn alone," the doctor said firmly. Martha smiled, touching the brooch at her throat. "No," she agreed softly, "I don't think any of us will be alone in what's coming." But as she rode home through the darkness, flanked by Abigail and Michael, who'd insisted on joining them, she felt the familiar ice entering her soul. Deadeye Mary had ruled through precision and spectacle. Martha Wilkins had built a life on kindness and trust. Now she would need to find a way to be both, and neither, if any of them were going to survive. Dawn broke over Elk Valley with an unnatural stillness. Martha stood at her inn's second-floor window, watching the sun paint the landscape in shades of amber and gold. She hadn't slept. The night had been spent making preparations that would have seemed strange to anyone who thought they knew the gentle widow Wilkins. The floorboards in the main dining room had been subtly loosened in strategic places, creating hidden caches for weapons. Furniture had been shifted inches at a time, transforming the familiar space into a deadly maze of choke points and crossfire zones. Even her beloved garden had been repurposed, certain plants now concealing tripwires and other surprises she remembered from her exhibition days, when safety mechanisms had been essential for the more dangerous stunts. "Quite a view, Abigail," Wright's voice carried from behind her. The doctor had insisted on staying the night, along with young Michael Carson. "Though I suspect you're not admiring the sunrise." Martha's lips curved slightly. "3 riders coming in from the north, been watching us for about an hour." Her voice had changed, carrying an edge of precision that would have seemed foreign to those who knew only the widow Wilkins. "Different. Men from yesterday, more professional." She touched the brooch at her throat, a gesture that had become almost unconscious. "In my previous life, I learned that the most dangerous observers are the ones who know how to stay hidden." Before Abigail could respond, hoofbeats approached from the direction of town. Michael Carson, who'd been keeping watch downstairs, called up, "Mrs. Wilkins, Sheriff Henderson's riding in." Martha's keen eyes noted how the hidden watchers shifted position at the sheriff's approach. Professionals indeed. The Blackwell gang was smarter than she'd given them credit for, sending their best scouts after yesterday's poor showing. Henderson dismounted heavily, his face grave. Martha met him at the door, coffee already prepared. Some habits of hospitality ran too deep to break, even in times of crisis. "More ranches hit in the night," he said without preamble once they were inside. "Closer this time. Family name of Prescott, about 15 miles east." "They're dead?" Abigail asked quietly. Henderson nodded grimly. "All except the youngest daughter. Found her walking down the road in her nightgown, mind broken by what she saw." He turned to Martha. "Mrs. Wilkins, I'm not asking any more. You need to come into town now." Martha poured coffee with steady hands, her mind racing. The Blackwells were sending a message, demonstrating what happened to those who didn't submit to their terror. It was a crude tactic, one she would never have employed in her Deadeye Mary days. Fear was a useful tool, but there were more efficient ways to employ it than random brutality. "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff," she said softly, "but I have preparations of my own to make." "Preparations?" Henderson's voice rose slightly. "Ma'am, with all due respect, what preparations could possibly—" The sound of approaching riders cut him off. Through her carefully positioned mirrors, Martha caught glimpses of men approaching from multiple directions. Too many for another. "Scouting party! Michael!" she called out calmly. "Be a dear and fetch my shawl from upstairs. The blue one." It was a pre-arranged signal. The boy immediately headed upstairs to the defensive position they'd prepared the night before. "Abigail, perhaps you could check our medical supplies." Another coded message. The doctor nodded and moved smoothly toward the kitchen where a loaded shotgun waited. "Mrs. Wilkins," Henderson started, but she cut him off with a gesture that carried echoes of command. "Sheriff, I believe we're about to have visitors, hostile ones." Her voice had changed completely, losing all trace of the widow's gentle tones. "You can either trust that I know what I'm doing, or you can interfere and likely get us all killed. Your choice." Henderson stared at her, seeing something in her bearing that made him reassess everything he thought he knew about Martha Wilkins. Before he could respond, 6 riders emerged from the morning haze, approaching her inn with casual menace. Martha recognized their leader immediately from wanted posters and whispered descriptions. James Blackwell himself, the eldest and most brutal of the Blackwell brothers. He was a big man, with a face like carved granite and eyes that reminded her of a rattlesnake's cold gaze. "Well, well," Blackwell's voice boomed across her yard. "The famous widow Wilkins. Heard you were entertaining some friends of mine." Martha stepped onto her porch, portraying the perfect image of a concerned hostess. "Mr. Blackwell, I presume. Your men mentioned you might be passing through." Every word was carefully chosen, letting him know she'd recognized his scouts while maintaining her harmless facade. Blackwell's eyes narrowed slightly. Behind him, his men spread out in a standard attack formation. Martha noted their positions with professional appreciation, even as she counted weapons and evaluated threats. These weren't common bandits. They moved with military precision. Passing through. Blackwell smiled, showing too many teeth. "Yes, ma'am, you might say that. Though how long we stay depends on how hospitable the locals prove to be." Henderson had moved to stand beside Martha, his hand near his gun. She wanted to tell him to stand down. He was good with a gun, but this wasn't his kind of fight. This was the kind of deadly game she'd played as Deadeye Mary, where every word carried hidden meaning and violence lurked beneath civil exchanges. "I'm sure we can come to an arrangement," Martha said smoothly. "Perhaps if you and your men would care to come in, we could discuss terms over coffee." Blackwell's laugh was harsh. "Ain't here for coffee, ma'am. Way I hear it, you've been giving shelter to men who mean me and mine harm. Sheriff Henderson here, for instance, has been asking too many questions about my business." "Simply doing my job," Henderson said firmly, though Martha felt him tense beside her. "Your job?" Blackwell spat to one side. "Your job's about to change. Lawman, from here on out you work for me. This town, these people, they're mine now. Everyone gives 20% of what they earn to my brothers as if on cue, more riders appeared, at least a dozen men, including Henry and Lewis. "Blackwell." They'd surrounded the inn while their leader talked, a tactic Martha herself had used many times during her touring days to control rowdy crowds. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They thought they were dealing with a widow and a small town sheriff. They had no idea they were facing the legendary Deadeye Mary. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Martha said softly, her voice carrying that deadly calm her old exhibition partners had learned to fear. "You see, Mr. Blackwell, some of us have seen your kind before. Men who mistake brutality for strength, who think terror is the same as respect." Something in her tone made Blackwell's snake eyes narrow further. Behind him, his more experienced men shifted uneasily in their saddles, sensing something dangerous in this seemingly harmless woman. "Careful, woman," Blackwell growled. "Braver, folks, than you have learned the price of defiance." Martha's smile was cold as mountain frost. "Have they? Or have you simply never met anyone who knows exactly how many men it takes to die before a gang loses its appetite for blood?" The threat was subtle but clear. Blackwell's face darkened with rage. "Burn it!" he snarled to his men. "Burn it all and make an example." But as his men moved to comply, Martha's careful preparations came into play. Michael, positioned upstairs with her old Winchester, fired first, taking Blackwell's hat off with surgical precision. Abigail's shotgun roared from the kitchen window, sending two raiders tumbling from their horses, and Martha Wilkins seemed to vanish, replaced by a figure from legend. Her movements were liquid grace as she drew twin Colts from hidden holsters. The first two shots emptied saddles with mechanical precision. The third caught Lewis Blackwell's gun hand, sending his weapon spinning away before he could aim. "Inside!" she commanded Henderson, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed in combat. The sheriff, to his credit, didn't argue. He'd seen enough to know he was witnessing something beyond his experience. As bullets began to fill the air, Martha Wilkins, the quiet widow who baked bread and served coffee, transformed completely into something deadly and precise. Dead-Eye Mary had returned, and blood would paint the valley floor before she was finished. The next few moments were pure chaos, but to Martha, time seemed to slow. Each movement, each shot was calculated with the precision that had made her legendary. She rolled behind one of her carefully positioned barrels, as return fire splintered her porch railing, already marking her next targets. "Abigail!" she called out. "Pattern 3!" The doctor, who had absorbed Martha's combat instructions with surprising speed the night before, immediately shifted her fire to the raiders trying to circle around back. The shotgun's boom was followed by cursing and the sound of falling bodies. Inside, she heard Henderson shouting orders to Michael, directing the boys' rifle fire with professional skill. Good. The sheriff had adapted quickly to the situation, putting aside his questions to focus on survival. "That ain't no widow, James." Blackwell's voice carried over the gunfire. "The way she moves." Martha allowed herself a cold smile as she put a bullet through a raider's shoulder. The Blackwell gang was finally realizing their mistake, but it was already too late. She'd positioned every piece of this deadly game exactly where she wanted it. "Pull back!" Blackwell commanded, real fear entering his voice for the first time. "Regroup at the rocks!" But Martha had anticipated this too. As the raiders tried to retreat to the boulder-strewn area east of her inn, hidden tripwires sent horses stumbling. The carefully planned crossfire from her windows turned the attempted withdrawal into a killing ground. "Mrs. Wilkins," Michael's voice carried from upstairs. "Riders coming from town." She risked a glance and saw dust rising on the road. Reinforcements from Elk Valley, drawn by the gunfire. The timing was problematic. She hadn't planned on witnesses to her full capabilities. "Abigail," she called out, switching smoothly to her widow's voice. "I believe our guests are leaving. Perhaps we should tend to the wounded." The doctor caught her meaning immediately. By the time help arrived, Martha Wilkins would be back in character, a lucky survivor rather than the architect of the Blackwell gang's bloodiest defeat. James Blackwell, nursing a bullet wound in his arm, gathered his remaining men. "This ain't over!" he shouted, rage and humiliation warring in his voice. "You hear me, woman? We're coming back with enough men to burn this place to the ground." Martha stepped back onto her bullet-riddled porch, making sure the approaching townspeople were close enough to hear her response. "Mr. Blackwell," she called out, her voice carrying just the right note of matronly disappointment, "I do wish you'd reconsider. I just baked fresh apple pie." The incongruity of her words, delivered, while dead and wounded men lay scattered across her yard, seemed to unnerve Blackwell more than any threat could have. He wheeled his horse around, leading his chastened forces in a retreat that bordered on rout. Jacob Turner arrived first with a group of armed townsmen, their horses lathered from hard riding. They pulled up short, staring at the scene of carnage. Before them, "Mrs. Wilkins," Turner's voice carried equal parts awe and disbelief. What happened here?" Martha was already shifting back into her widow persona, though she kept her hands close to her hidden weapons. "Oh, Mr. Turner, thank heavens you've come. Those horrible men." She let her voice tremble slightly. "If it weren't for Sheriff Henderson's bravery and dear Abigail's presence of mind with her father's old shotgun." Henderson, emerging from the inn, gave her a long look, but played along. "Seems our Mrs. Wilkins is full of surprises." had the presence of mind to send Michael upstairs with a rifle while we held them off. Abigail joined them, her doctor's instincts taking over as she moved to check the wounded raiders. Some of these men need immediate attention. Mr. Turner, could you send someone for my supplies from the clinic? The scene quickly transformed into one of organized chaos as more townspeople arrived. Martha moved through it all with perfect composure, serving coffee to the shocked defenders while providing a carefully edited version of events that credited luck and the sheriff's leadership for their survival. But she knew this was only the beginning. James Blackwell had recognized something in her movements, something that would nag at his memory. He'd be back, and next time he'd bring an army. Later, after the wounded had been tended and the dead carried away, Abigail cornered her in the kitchen. "Want to tell me what really happened out there?" the doctor demanded quietly. "Because I've seen combat medicine during the war, and those weren't the wounds of a lucky defense. Those men were taken apart by someone who knew exactly what they were doing." Martha met her friend's gaze steadily. "Would the truth make you think less of me?" "The truth," Abigail replied, "is that you just saved all our lives with skills no simple widow should possess. I'm not sure I want to know where you learned them, but I'm damn glad you did." Before Martha could respond, Henderson joined them. The sheriff's weathered face was troubled. "Ma'am, we need to talk about what happened here, about who you really are." "Do we, Sheriff?" Martha's voice carried a warning edge. "Or do we need to focus on preparing for what's coming next?" Henderson studied her for a long moment. "Those men you killed, 3 of them were former cavalry, 2 more were experienced gunmen with prices on their heads. No ordinary woman could have—" "Perhaps," Martha cut him off gently. "There are questions better left unasked, especially when the answers might complicate your duty as a lawman." Understanding dawned in Henderson's eyes. Whatever suspicions he had about her true identity, he was choosing to let them rest. Sometimes he realized justice wore strange disguises. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Martha supervised repairs to her inn while quietly repositioning her defenses. The Blackwell gang would analyze their failure, adapt their tactics. Next time they'd be ready for a fight, but so would she. As she worked, her mind was already spinning plans within plans. Deadeye Mary hadn't survived so long by being predictable. James Blackwell thought he'd faced her best defense, but he had no idea what she was truly capable of. Michael Carson, helping her board up broken windows, paused in his work. "Mrs. Wilkins, can you teach me to shoot like that?" She looked at the boy thoughtfully. In her exhibition days, she'd trained many young assistants, molding them into skilled performers who could support her act. But that had been different. They'd chosen that life. Michael deserved better. "Some skills," she said carefully, "come with a price that's too high for good people to pay. Better you learn from Sheriff Henderson. He'll teach you to protect what matters without losing yourself." But as she watched the sun set through her damaged windows, Martha knew she was past such concerns for herself. Deadeye Mary had been many things: exhibition star, celebrity legend, but never a protector. Now, watching the townspeople work together to strengthen their defenses, she felt something new stirring in her soul. She'd spent 10 years hiding from her past, building a life based on gentle deception, but perhaps it was time for the widow Wilkins and Deadeye Mary to find a balance, not for her own sake, but for the people who had given her a home when she'd needed one most. "More coffee, Sheriff?" she called out, playing her role perfectly, even as her mind calculated ammunition stores and defensive positions. The coming storm would test them all, but she'd faced worse odds in her time. After all, as she'd once told her exhibition troupe, long ago, the most dangerous predator is the one everyone underestimates. Night fell over Elk Valley like a velvet shroud, bringing with it an uneasy quiet. The day's violence had left its mark, bloodstains in the dust that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase, bullet holes in wooden walls, and most significantly, whispered questions about the widow Wilkins that no one quite dared to ask aloud. Martha stood at her second-floor window, watching the moon paint silver shadows across her yard. She'd spent the afternoon maintaining her carefully constructed facade, serving coffee to the townspeople who came to help with repairs, deflecting questions with gentle smiles, playing the role of the fortunate survivor. But now, alone in the darkness, she allowed the mask to slip. The Winchester rifle was a comforting weight in her hands as she moved through her practiced scanning pattern, checking sight lines and potential approach routes. In the distance, she could see the flicker of campfires. Blackwell's men regroup and plot their revenge. They'd lost 8 dead, 5 wounded in the morning's fight, the sort of losses that demanded an answer in blood. A soft knock at her door made her turn, weapon ready, but it was only Abigail Wright. "You should be resting," Martha said quietly, not taking her eyes from the window. "So should you." The doctor moved to stand beside her, studying her friend's profile in the moonlight. "But I suspect Deadeye Mary doesn't rest much on nights like this." Martha went very still. "What did you say?" "I was an army surgeon during the war," Abigail replied calmly. "Spent time in Chicago afterward, heard stories about a woman sharpshooter who could hit targets other marksmen wouldn't even attempt. They said she could shoot a playing card edge on, split a bullet on a knife blade, hit 9 moving targets in succession." She paused. "They also said she vanished 10 years ago. Around the same time, a mysterious fire claimed several lives during an exhibition." "Stories," Martha said softly. "I have a way of growing in the telling." "Indeed," Abigail's voice held no judgment. Just like the story of how a widow, with no apparent combat experience, managed to outmaneuver and outfight 20 professional killers this morning. Before Martha could respond, movement in the yard caught her attention. A lone figure was approaching. On foot, hands raised in the universal gesture of parley. The moonlight revealed it to be Henry Blackwell, the middle brother. "Company," Martha murmured. "Get Henderson. Tell him to watch the flanks. This could be a distraction." Abigail nodded and slipped away as Martha moved downstairs. She positioned herself carefully before opening the door, making sure any hidden shooters would find only shadows where she should be. "Evening, Mr. Blackwell," she called out, her widow's voice perfectly modulated. "Rather late for social calls." Henry Blackwell stopped at the edge of her porch. He was the least violent of the brothers, rumored to be the brains of their operation. "Mrs. Wilkins, or should I say Miss Mason?" Martha's finger tightened slightly on her rifle's trigger. "I'm afraid I don't follow." "No?" Blackwell's voice carried a hint of satisfied triumph. "Funny thing about reputations, they linger. After this morning's excitement, I had a talk with some old-timers who saw the Buffalo Bill Wild West show years back. They remembered stories about Deadeye Mary Mason, about how she moved in a fight, just like you moved today." In the shadows, Martha allowed herself a cold smile. "Stories about sharpshooters are like tales of lost gold mines, Mr. Blackwell. Everyone's heard them, but few can prove them true." "Maybe." He took a careful step forward. "But James is convinced. Says there's only one woman he's ever heard of who could fight like that. Of course, if he's right, that presents us with quite an opportunity." "Does it?" "Way, he figures it. Either you're Mary Mason herself, in which case your exhibition sponsors would pay handsomely to know where you disappeared to, or you're good enough to make folks believe you are. Either way, when word spreads about who's really running this little inn..." He left the implication hanging. "Assuming," Martha interrupted softly, "anyone lived to spread such tales." The threat hung in the air between them. In the distance, Martha's keen ears caught the sound of horses. Henderson and his men moving into position around the inn's perimeter. "Could we come to an arrangement?" Henry offered. "Territory's big enough for two legends. Combine our operations, split everything equal. Just like in the old days, when the queen of the sharpshooters could command top dollar from Chicago to San Francisco." For a moment Martha felt the temptation, not of violence or power, but of simplicity. The exhibition life had clear rules, uncomplicated loyalties. Being Deadeye Mary had been easier in many ways than maintaining the widow Wilkins's careful deceptions. But then she thought of Michael Carson's eager face as he helped repair her windows, of Emily's friendship, Abigail's quiet understanding, the town's trust. She'd built something real here, something that mattered more than fame or reputation. "An interesting offer," she said finally, "but I'm afraid I must decline. You see, Mr. Blackwell, I have biscuits in the oven." He stared at her, confused by the non sequitur, then stiffened as he felt the press of multiple rifle barrels emerging from the shadows around him. Sheriff Henderson's men had him surrounded. "Ma'am?" Henderson's voice carried from the darkness. "Everything all right?" "Perfectly fine, Sheriff," Martha replied pleasantly. "Mr. Blackwell was just leaving." Though she let her voice harden slightly, "You might tell your brother that if he's so interested in old stories, he should remember how they end. The great Deadeye Mary never missed a target when the stakes mattered." Henry Blackwell backed away slowly, his face a mask of frustrated calculation. "This ain't over." "No," Martha agreed softly, "but it will be soon." After he'd gone, Henderson emerged from the shadows. "Mind telling me what that was about?" "Just a man trying to make sense of things he doesn't understand." Martha deflected smoothly. "Coffee, Sheriff. It's going to be a long night." But as she served coffee to Henderson and his men, Martha's mind was racing. The Blackwell gang, knowing her true identity, complicated things enormously. It would bring attention, curiosity seekers, perhaps even representatives from her old exhibition. Sponsors looking to capitalize on her rediscovery. Everything she'd built here could come crashing down. Yet strangely, she felt almost relieved. Maintaining the widow Wilkins's perfect facade had been exhausting. Perhaps it was time to find a balance between who she had been and who she had become. In her kitchen, Abigail was preparing bandages for the inevitable next round of violence. "They'll spread the word about you," the doctor said quietly. "Every gunslinger and glory seeker west of the Mississippi will come looking for Deadeye Mary. Let them come." Martha checked her revolvers with practiced ease. "I chose this place as a refuge, but maybe it was always meant to be a fortress, a line in the sand between chaos and civilization. And which side of that line do you stand on?" Martha's smile was complex. "Maybe there's a third path." Mary Mason protected her troop in her way. Perhaps it's time to expand the definition of what's worth protecting. Outside, the campfires had multiplied. James Blackwell was calling in reinforcements, preparing for a siege that would become legend across the territories. But he was still, thinking like an outlaw, measuring victory in blood and plunder. Martha knew better. She'd learned that true power lay not in how many targets you could hit, but in how many you could inspire to stand beside you. The widow Wilkins had built trust, formed bonds that went deeper than fear or greed. Combined with Deadeye Mary's strategic genius, it made for a formidable defense. "Abigail," she said suddenly, "I need you to carry a message into town. Tell Emily to open her cellar. The old tunnel from the mining days runs right under it. And find Michael. It's time he learned some of those skills he's been asking about." The doctor raised an eyebrow. "Starting to sound like an exhibition director again." "No," Martha touched the brooch at her throat. "Starting to sound like someone who knows that the best way to defeat men like the Blackwells is to give good people the tools to defend themselves." As Abigail rode into town, Martha returned to her vigil at the window. The moon cast long shadows across her carefully tended garden, now transformed into a killing ground. Tomorrow would bring violence and revelation, testing the bonds she'd built and the secrets she'd kept, but for the first time in 10 years, she felt truly whole. Deadeye Mary had ruled through precision and spectacle. The widow Wilkins had built a life on trust and service. Now, as the desert wind carried the scent of the coming battle, Martha prepared to become something new, a protector who combined the best of both women, using her dark skills in service of something brighter than mere survival. A flurry of activity in town drew her attention. Through her carefully positioned mirrors, she caught glimpses of riders moving in the darkness. Not Blackwell's men, but townspeople mobilizing under Henderson's direction. The sheriff was proving more adaptable than she'd expected. Quickly, grasping the principles of defense she'd subtly suggested during their earlier conversations. "Mrs. Wilkins," Michael's voice carried from below, "Dr. Wright sent me, said you needed help with something important." Martha smiled slightly. The boy had natural talent. She hadn't even heard him approach. "Come up, Michael, and bring that rifle of yours." As he joined her at the window, she studied him with professional assessment. Young, yes, but with the same steady hands and quick mind she'd once looked for in potential exhibition assistants. In another life, she'd have made him a support performer, taught him the intricate dance of timing and precision that had kept her act one step ahead of the competition. "See those campfires?" she asked, pointing to the distant lights. "Tell me what you notice." Michael squinted into the darkness. "They're spread out. Some seem brighter than they need to be." "Good," she nodded approvingly. "They're trying to make their numbers look larger than they are. Classic intimidation tactic. But look there and there." She pointed to darker patches between the fires. "That's where their real strength is concentrated." "How can you tell?" "Experience." She touched his shoulder gently. "Michael, what I'm about to teach you, it's not just about shooting. It's about understanding how men think when they're planning violence." "Are you sure you want to learn that?" The boy's face hardened with memory, after what the Blackwells had done to the Prescott family. "Yes, ma'am. I want to learn everything." Martha felt a familiar ache. She'd seen that same determination in other young faces and taught them to channel it into deadly skill. Some had died, others had become as brutal as the men they fought, but perhaps this time could be different. Very well. She began explaining the basics of tactical observation, the same lessons she'd once used to train her exhibition assistants. But this time she added something new: wisdom about when not to shoot, how to protect without destroying ways, to use skill as a deterrent rather than just a weapon. A knock at the door interrupted them. Emily Carson entered, carrying a large basket. "Abigail said you needed supplies. I brought everything I could think of." Martha examined the contents with approval. Emily had shown remarkable intuition, including items that could serve multiple purposes. Bandages that could also be used for cleaning guns, cooking oil that could make floors treacherously slick, common materials that could become uncommon weapons in the right hands. "Perfect," Martha said softly. "Emily, I need you to help coordinate between Abigail and the other women in town. They'll be crucial for what's coming." "The other women?" Emily looked confused. "But surely when the fighting starts—" "When the fighting starts," Martha interrupted, firmly, "we'll need every advantage. The Blackwells expect men with guns. They won't expect messages passed through laundry lines, or children carrying vital intelligence, or women noting every detail about their movements while serving food. And coffee." Understanding dawned in Emily's eyes. "Like you've been doing all these years, watching, learning, preparing." "Just so." Martha allowed some of her true self to show through the widow's mask. "A wise leader uses every resource, every advantage. The Blackwells think strength lies in violence alone. We'll show them otherwise." As if to punctuate her words, a shot rang out in the darkness. Everyone tensed, but Martha merely smiled. "Right on schedule. That'll be Jacob Turner's boys testing their ranges, just like I suggested to Henderson. The Blackwells will waste ammunition. They're shooting at shadows all night. She turned to Michael. Lesson 1. The mind is a weapon too. Sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is to make them defeat themselves. Through the night, Martha continued teaching, not just Michael, but Emily and others who came seeking guidance. She taught them to move silently, to observe keenly, and to think tactically. But more importantly, she taught them to work together, to transform their community's bonds into a defensive strength the Blackwells couldn't match. Abigail returned near midnight, carrying news from town. Henderson got men positioned according to your suggestions. The mining tunnels are ready. She paused. But there's something else. Riders came in from the south, words spreading about Deadeye Mary being alive. Martha had expected this. How are people taking it? Mixed reactions. Some are scared, others excited. Old Jacob Turner claims he saw your exhibition once, back in '73. Did he now? Martha's smile held genuine amusement. Funny, I don't recall him. Though there was a Turner boy, young, eager, a bit reckless, lost him in a crowd in Denver. His nephew, Abigail said softly. Jacob's been carrying that guilt a long time. Martha nodded thoughtfully. The past had a way of creating unexpected connections. Have him coordinate our spotters. He'll understand the importance of keeping young men like Michael alive. As the night deepened, more townspeople arrived, seeking instruction or offering support. Martha moved among them with fluid grace, shifting seamlessly between the widow's gentle guidance and the sharpshooter's tactical precision. She was becoming something new, she realized. Not just a fusion of her two identities, but a leader of a different kind. Mrs. Wilkins. It was Marcus Fletcher from the telegraph office. Found something you might want. He held out a worn leather gun belt. The holster's clearly custom-made for a smaller frame. Belonged to my wife. She was quite the marksman herself before consumption took her. Reckon she'd want you to have these. Martha took the gun belt reverently. She remembered commissioning similar holsters, designed specifically for quick drawing, during the more dramatic portions of her act. I'll use them well, she promised. And Marcus, your wife would be proud of what you've built here. As she buckled on the familiar weight, Martha felt the last barriers between her two lives beginning to dissolve. The widow Wilkins' compassion and Mary Mason's lethal skill were merging into something stronger than either alone. A defender who could nurture what was good while standing firmly against what was evil. Near dawn, she gathered her impromptu council, Abigail, Henderson, Emily, and Michael, in her kitchen. The same room where she'd served countless meals now became a war room, with maps spread across her familiar table. Tomorrow, she said quietly, the Blackwells will expect us to break, to run or surrender or die. They think they're facing a town defending itself. We need to show them they're facing something else entirely. A community that's learned to combine hospitality with strength, mercy with justice. Like you have? Abigail asked pointedly. Martha touched the brooch at her throat, feeling the weight of both her pasts and the promise of her future. Perhaps that's what I've been learning these 10 years. Mary Mason fought for fame. The widow Wilkins fought for peace. Maybe it's time to fight for something greater, the right of good people to live without fear. As the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky, Martha Wilkins stood at her window one final time. But now she stood differently, no longer hiding who she was, but embracing all of it. The gentle widow and the legendary sharpshooter had found common cause in protecting this place and these people. The Blackwells were about to learn a harsh lesson. The most dangerous force in the territory wasn't a gang of brutal killers, or even a legendary exhibition shooter. It was a community unified by trust and led by someone who understood both the power of compassion and the necessity of strength. Dawn broke over Elk Valley with the color of spilled blood, painting the landscape in shades of crimson that seemed to herald the violence to come. Martha stood on her bullet-scarred porch, sipping coffee with deceptive calm, while her keen eyes tracked movement in the surrounding terrain. The Blackwell gang had been busy through the night, positioning men in the rocky outcrops that surrounded her inn. "They're getting bolder," Abigail observed, joining her with her own coffee cup. The doctor had traded her usual skirts for practical riding clothes, a shotgun slung across her back. "Counted at least 20 new riders arriving before sunrise." Martha nodded slightly. "James is calling in every favor he has. See those men by the eastern rocks? Walsh's crew used to work the gold shipments from Nevada, and that group setting up behind the old mining equipment. Thornton's Rangers, notorious for their siege work during the war." She spoke with the casual familiarity of someone who had once moved in these same circles, who knew the intricate web of alliances and vendettas that connected the territory's outlaws. Deadeye Mary's intelligence network had been legendary. Her exhibition tours had taken her through every major settlement in the West, and she'd always had a knack for remembering faces and details. "Mrs. Wilkins," Michael's voice carried from his observation post upstairs. "Rider coming in. Looks like Emily." Martha's hand moved instinctively to her gun as she spotted Emily Carson's horse approaching at a gallop. The storekeeper was riding hard, fear evident in her posture. "Cover her approach," Martha commanded, and rifles appeared at windows around the inn. Even the Blackwell gang seemed to hold their fire. Perhaps curious about this unexpected development, Emily practically fell from her horse at the porch steps. "They took him," she gasped. "They took Thomas." Martha's face went very still. Thomas Grant was the rancher who'd been helping organize the town's defenses at her suggestion. "Tell me." "He was helping watch the North Road, like you said. A group of riders came out of nowhere." Emily fought for composure. "They knew exactly where to find him. Someone must have talked." Abigail cursed softly, but Martha's voice remained deadly calm. "When?" "Not an hour ago. They're holding him at the old Coppermine. Emily swallowed hard. "They sent a message. Said Deadeye Mary would know what it means. Said, 'Remember Chicago.'" Martha's fingers tightened on her coffee cup until her knuckles went white. The name struck her like a physical blow, carrying echoes of her darkest day. The fire that had claimed several lives, the event that had finally convinced her to abandon her exhibition ways. "Abigail," she said quietly, "get Emily inside. Sheriff Henderson needs to know about this, and find Jacob Turner. Tell him it's time to open the old route beneath the church." But as her friends moved to comply, Martha remained motionless on her porch, staring toward the distant hills where the abandoned copper mine waited. The morning sun caught the silver streaks in her hair, making them shine like heated steel. "Ma'am." One of Henderson's deputies approached hesitantly. "What are they talking about? What happened in Chicago?" Martha's smile was cold as mountain frost. "A lesson, deputy, about the difference between entertainment and murder." She turned to enter the inn, her movements carrying that fluid grace that marked her as something far more dangerous than a simple widow. "One I fear I'll have to teach again." Inside, she moved quickly to her bedroom, unlocking the trunk that held the remnants of her past. Beneath the false bottom lay items she hadn't touched in a decade, a fitted leather shooting vest whose hidden pockets could hold an arsenal of ammunition, custom-made goggles that had protected her eyes during the more dangerous stunts, and most significantly, a blue silk neckerchief emblazoned with a silver star, her trademark, which had given rise to the Deadeye nickname. "You're not going alone." Abigail stood in the doorway, watching her friend transform. "I'm the one they want," Martha replied, checking her weapons with practiced efficiency. She slid the pearl-handled Colts into the holsters Marcus Fletcher had given her, their familiar weight settling at her hips like old friends. This is between me and the Blackwells now. What happened in Chicago, Martha? Abigail's voice was gentle, but insistent. Martha paused, touching the silver brooch at her throat. 10 years ago, I was at the height of my fame. The Deadeye Mary exhibition was selling out venues across the country. My sponsors were making a fortune. I had it all. Fame, money, adulation. She moved to the window, looking toward the distant mine where Thomas Grant was being held. The Chicago event was supposed to be the biggest yet. We'd rented out the Grand Pavilion, advertised special stunts never before attempted. What I didn't know was that my manager had cut corners on safety to increase profits. Her voice grew distant, lost in memory. During the finale, when I was to shoot a flaming arrow through a series of targets, something went wrong. The fire spread to the decorations, then to the wooden supports. The pavilion went up like tinder. She closed, her eyes against the memory. 7 people died that night, 2 children. The official investigation blamed faulty equipment, but I knew better. You blame yourself, Abigail said quietly. It wasn't a question. I was the star, the name on the posters. It was my responsibility to ensure everything was safe. Martha's fingers brushed the blue neckerchief. After the fire, I discovered my manager had been taking bribes from a rival exhibition to sabotage my performance. The Blackwell brothers were working security for that event. They knew what was planned and did nothing. So you disappeared, Abigail finished, understanding dawning. Became Martha Wilkins. I hunted down everyone responsible first. Martha's voice hardened, made them pay, all except the Blackwells, who'd already fled west. I thought I'd never see them again. Her smile was terrible to behold. I was wrong. That's why they're using Thomas as bait, Abigail realized. They know you'll come for him. They think they're being clever. Martha tied the blue neckerchief at her throat, the silk bright against her practical clothing. Using an innocent meant to draw out Deadeye Mary, but they've forgotten something important, something they should have remembered from Chicago. What's that? Martha's smile was cold as steel. I never miss a target I truly aim for. A commotion outside caught their attention. Riders approaching from town. Sheriff Henderson led them, accompanied by Marcus Fletcher, Jacob Turner, and a dozen other determined-looking men from Elk Valley. Your army arrives, Abigail observed dryly, but Martha shook her head. Not an army, a community. That's what the Blackwells never understood. True strength isn't about how many guns you have, it's about what you're willing to fight for. She descended to meet Henderson and his men, her bearing transformed. Gone was any trace of the gentle widow Wilkins. Each step carried the deadly grace of Deadeye Mary, the legend who had once dazzled audiences across the nation through a combination of showmanship and unprecedented skill. "Sheriff," she called out as they dismounted, "I assume you've heard?" Henderson nodded grimly. "Emily told us, Mrs. Wilkins, or should I say, Miss Mason. We're with you. These men volunteered." "The boy's my responsibility," she cut him off, "but I'll need you here. The Blackwells will expect us to focus on the mine, leaving the town vulnerable. That's their real play." "And Thomas?" Marcus Fletcher demanded. "Trust me." Martha's voice carried absolute authority. "I've handled worse odds. What I need from you is to protect what matters. The town, the people, everything we've built here." She surveyed the group, seeing not just armed men, but representatives of the community she'd grown to love. Marcus Fletcher, who'd given her his wife's gun belt. Jacob Turner, carrying his family's legacy. Sheriff Henderson, who understood that sometimes justice wore unexpected faces. "The Blackwells think they're clever," she continued, her voice carrying across the yard, "using an innocent man to draw out Deadeye Mary. But they've forgotten something important, something they should have remembered from Chicago." "What's that?" someone asked. Martha's smile was cold as winter steel. "I protect my own. And now, after 10 years of peace, they've finally given me a reason to show them why that made me so dangerous. She checked her weapons one final time, each movement precise and practiced. The twin Colts gleamed in the morning sun, and the Winchester, rifle across her back, caught the light like a promise of violence to come. "Abigail," she said quietly, "get your medical supplies ready. There'll be a need for them before this day is done." She turned to Henderson. "Sheriff, I'm about to create one hell of a distraction. When you see the signal, hit them hard from the south. They won't be expecting organized resistance. Use that." "And what signal would that be?" Henderson asked. Martha mounted her horse. With fluid grace, the blue neckerchief settling around her throat like a battle flag. "Oh, you'll know it when you see it. Dead-Eye Mary was never one for subtlety when it came to making statements." As she rode out, the rising sun at her back, casting her shadow long across the valley floor, Martha felt the weight of both her identities settling into something new. The widow's compassion tempered the sharpshooter's ruthlessness, while Mary's strength gave purpose to the widow's gentility. The Blackwells had made a crucial mistake. They thought they were forcing her to choose between her past and present. Instead, they'd given her the perfect opportunity to prove that sometimes the most dangerous force in the world is someone who has learned to balance showmanship with substance, fame with humility. Behind her, the inn that had been her refuge, for 10 years, stood like a fortress in the morning light. Before her, the copper mine waited with its stolen innocence and its echoes of past sins. And somewhere between them rode a woman who was neither fully the sharpshooter nor truly the widow, but something altogether more dangerous, a legend who had learned the true meaning of having something worth fighting for. As Martha rode toward the mine, memories of Chicago flickered through her mind like flames. She remembered the screams, the choking smoke, the terrible moment when she'd realized children were trapped inside. The Blackwell brothers had been paid to look the other way, their actions that day indirectly claiming innocent lives. The knowledge had shattered something in her soul, transforming Dead-Eye Mary from a celebrated entertainer into an instrument of vengeance. "Mrs. Wilkins," a voice called out behind her. She turned to see Michael Carson riding hard to catch up, his rifle strapped to his saddle. "Go back, Michael," she commanded, but he shook his head stubbornly. "My father took me to see your show," he said quietly, "in Denver just before he died. Said you were the finest shot he'd ever seen. Said watching you made him believe that skill mattered more than brute strength." Martha reined in her horse, studying the boy with new eyes. "Carson. Not related. To Harold Carson by any chance?" "My father." Michael's face lit up. "Do you remember him?" "He won the amateur competition I held after every show," she said softly. "Hit every target, almost as clean as I could. I offered him a job with my exhibition, but he said he had a family to think about. That was the year before the fever took him." Michael's face was determined. "He taught me everything he knew about shooting. Said if I practiced hard enough, maybe someday I could compete in Dead-Eye Mary's tournament." She considered him for a long moment. The Carsons had indeed been valuable allies in her exhibition days. Harold's marksmanship had impressed her, and now his son showed the same steady hand and clear eye. Having someone with those skills now could prove crucial. "Very well," she nodded. "But we do this my way. The Blackwells expect me to come in shooting. They've prepared for that, set their traps accordingly. We're going to show them something they don't expect." As they rode, she outlined her plan. Michael listened intently, occasionally offering suggestions based on his knowledge of the local terrain. The old copper mine had been abandoned years ago when the silver played out, but as the owner's son, he knew its twisted passages intimately. "There's another way in," he explained, sketching a rough map in the dust. "Old ventilation shaft comes up behind the main entrance, narrow but passable. They won't have it watched. Most folks don't even know it exists." Martha's smile was predatory. Perfect. Now, about that shooting skill of yours. How fast can you reload that Winchester? They paused at a sheltered arroyo while Martha made her final preparations, checking weapons and mentally mapping approaches. The mine's location was both advantageous and challenging. Good sightlines for defenders, but also limited escape. Roots, tell me about Thomas Grant, she said as she worked. What kind of man is he? Honest. Tough. Michael's hands moved deftly, preparing extra ammunition as she'd shown him. Lost his wife to smallpox 2 years back. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's always fair with his ranch hands. First to offer help when the Harass place flooded last spring. Martha touched the blue neckerchief at her throat. A good man, then. The kind worth riding for. A dust cloud on the horizon caught her attention. Through her field glasses, she spotted riders approaching the mine. More of Blackwell's reinforcements. Among them, she recognized faces from her past. Men who had once worked security at various exhibition venues across the country. They're gathering quite an army, Michael observed. Must be at least 40 men. 47, Martha corrected absently, including at least 10 I once counted as colleagues. Her voice hardened. Men who knew my standards, knew what I expected. In terms of safety and professionalism, now they ride with arsonists and murderers. Why? If they respected you so much before, because fear fades, she explained, checking her weapons one final time. But greed, pride, the desire for revenge, those things grow stronger with time. Every man up there thinks capturing Deadeye Mary will make him a legend. She turned to face him fully, letting him see both the widow's compassion and the sharpshooter's steel in her eyes. That's why we're not going to give them what they expect. Deadeye Mary would ride in shooting, trusting in skill and reputation. But I'm not just Deadeye Mary anymore. Understanding dawned in Michael's face. You're going to surrender. I'm going to give them exactly what they think they want. She secured her blue neckerchief and checked her ammunition one last time. And while they're congratulating themselves on capturing the great Deadeye Mary, they'll forget the most important lesson I ever taught during my exhibitions. Which is? Martha's smile was terrible to behold. The most dangerous opponent isn't the one who threatens violence. It's the one who makes you think you've already won. She could see Thomas Grant now, tied to a post outside the mine entrance. The rancher was bruised but defiant, his weathered face set in lines of determination that made her heart ache with recognition. He'd fought them, clearly, just as she would have in his place. Michael, she said softly, whatever happens up there, remember your part. When you see the signal, I'll be ready, he promised, just like my father would have been for you. Before Martha mounted up, she adjusted the blue neckerchief once more, ensuring it would be clearly visible. The sun had climbed higher, turning the valley into a furnace that matched the cold fire in her heart. Behind her, she knew Abigail would have the surgery ready. Henderson's men would be in position, and the town would be preparing its own surprises. The Blackwells thought they were springing a trap. They didn't understand that every move since Thomas Grant's capture had been orchestrated, every reaction predicted and planned for. They were about to learn why Deadeye Mary's legend had endured long after she supposedly retired, and why crossing her was still the most dangerous mistake anyone could make in the territories. One last thing, she told Michael. If I don't make it back, tell Abigail and the others. Tell them Martha Wilkins wasn't entirely an act. These past 10 years, serving others instead of dazzling them, they taught me something worth dying for. With that, she rode toward the mine, her blue neckerchief flowing behind her like a battle standard. Deadeye Mary was going to her execution, just as the Blackwells planned. But Martha Wilkins was riding to protect her people, and in that combination lay a power that no amount of guns or outlaws could match. Chaos erupted as Blackwell's men realized their carefully planned trap had become a killing ground. Martha's, horse trained for just such moments, pivoted smoothly as she fired, presenting the smallest possible target while giving her the maximum field of fire. "Now, Michael," she called out, and explosions rocked the mine entrance, not enough to collapse it, she'd been very specific about that, but enough to send men diving for cover that didn't exist. Thomas Grant was already running, making for the position they'd planned. Martha covered his retreat with mechanical precision, each shot finding its mark. She'd always been a remarkable shot, but 10 years of peace hadn't dulled her skills. If anything, the stakes had sharpened them. "Kill her!" James Blackwell screamed, clutching his bleeding shoulder where her first shot had found him. 500. To the man who brings me her head, but his men were already discovering the next part of her trap. The ground around the mine entrance, apparently solid, suddenly gave way beneath their feet, the result of Michael's careful work with those mining charges. Not enough to kill, but more than enough to create confusion and fear. "Remember this. If feeling," Martha called out as she smoothly reloaded. "Remember what it's like to face someone who plans 3 steps ahead, who knows your weaknesses because she's studied your every move." A bullet whined past her ear, one of the few men steady enough to take actual aim. She returned fire without seeming to look, and the shooter fell with a cry of pain. That was Wilson. She identified the fallen man. "Good shot, but he always squints his left eye before firing. I spotted that weakness the moment he walked into my inn." More explosions rocked the area, the signal for Henderson's men to begin their attack from the south. The Blackwells found themselves caught in a crossfire, with Martha's deadly accuracy from the front and the town's defenders pressing from behind. But Martha wasn't finished. This wasn't just about winning a gunfight. It was about teaching a lesson that would echo across the territories. She wanted witnesses to spread the word. Deadeye Mary might have retired, but she was far from helpless. 10 years ago," she called out between shots, "you 3 brothers took blood money to look the other way, thought you could hide from the consequences." Another shot, another cry of pain. "But I never stopped watching, never stopped planning." Henry Blackwell, always the smartest of the brothers, began backing away. "James, this ain't worth it. She's not just shooting to kill, she's making examples." He was right. Martha's shots were precisely placed. Painful, but not immediately fatal. She wanted them to live with their wounds, just as she'd lived with the memories of Chicago. Deadeye Mary was feared because she never missed, she continued, her voice carrying over the gunfire. When she promised a show, it meant something. When she threatened consequence, that meant something too. More of Blackwell's men were throwing down their weapons now, realizing they were caught in something far bigger than a simple revenge plot. They'd come expecting to help kill a legend. Instead, they were becoming part of her legend's next chapter. Thomas Grant had reached safety behind a rock outcropping where Michael was keeping Blackwell's remaining men pinned down with well-placed shots. Henderson's forces were steadily advancing, using the confusion to maximum advantage. Everything was proceeding exactly as Martha had planned. But James Blackwell, maddened by pain and humiliation, wasn't finished. With his good arm, he drew a second gun and charged straight at her, screaming incoherently. Martha watched him come, with almost pitying calm. This too, she had expected. Some men simply couldn't accept defeat. They had to be broken completely before they would stop. Her next shot took him in the leg, dropping him to the dust. The final bullet in her gun she saved, watching him crawl toward her with hatred in his eyes. "You want to know the real story of Chicago?" she asked softly, though her voice carried to every ear. "Why did Deadeye Mary really disappear? It wasn't just about the children who died. It was about learning that some victories come at too high a price." She dismounted smoothly, standing over her fallen enemy. James Blackwell glared up at her with snake's eyes, still trying to raise his gun. "I could kill you," she continued conversationally. Should kill you by the old laws, but then I'd be what you always thought I was, just another killer. And I've learned to be something more. With lightning speed, she kicked his gun away and stepped back. You'll live, James. Live to face justice in a court of law. Live to tell others what happens when they mistake kindness for weakness. Live to remember that Deadeye Mary's real power was never in her guns. It was in knowing which battles were worth fighting and which victories were worth winning. The silence that followed was deafening. Around them, the shooting had largely stopped as Blackwell's remaining men surrendered to Henderson's forces. But Martha kept her guard up. She'd survived this long by never assuming a fight was truly over until every threat was neutralized. "Mrs. Wilkins," Michael's voice carried from his position of safety. "Behind you!" She spun just as Henry Blackwell, who'd been quietly crawling through the chaos, launched himself at her with a knife. Her response was pure instinct, a fluid movement that seemed almost dance-like in its deadly grace. The knife went flying as she used his own momentum against him, sending him sprawling in the dust. "Ah, Henry," she said softly, not even breathing hard, "still leading with your left shoulder. Another weakness you never corrected." The young man looked up at her with a mixture of fear and awe. How did you know I was there?" "Your brother. James was watching over my shoulder, trying not to give you away. He never was good at hiding his lies." She kept her gun trained on him while addressing the gathered crowd. "That's another lesson for those taking notes. A leader's weakness isn't just in their own failings, but in those they trust." "Sheriff." Henderson approached cautiously, his men securing the various prisoners. "Ma'am, the town is secured. Abigail's got a medical setup at your inn for the wounded." Martha nodded, her tactical mind already processing the aftermath. "Sort the prisoners carefully, Sheriff. Some of these men were just hired guns. They deserve a chance at redemption. But the ones who were in Chicago—" Her voice hardened. "They need to face special justice." "Special justice?" Henderson asked. "There's a judge in Illinois," she explained. "One who remembers what happened that day. He'll make sure they answer for all their crimes, not just today's." Michael emerged from his position, Thomas Grant close behind him. The young man was grinning, broadly. "Just like you described, though I remember my father saying you used to be more dramatic in your exhibitions." "Dramatic?" Martha raised an eyebrow. "Harold said that. He told me about the time in Kansas City when you faced down 30 drunken cowboys with just—" "Those stories," she interrupted firmly. Through her eyes twinkled, "grow more elaborate with each telling. Though your father did always have a gift for embellishment." Thomas Grant was staring at her with undisguised admiration. "Are you really her? Deadeye Mary? All those stories about the split bullets and the playing card trick?" "Stories," Martha said firmly, "are often less interesting than the truth. And the truth is, Mr. Grant, you showed remarkable courage today. Your ranch hands will be proud." As if summoned by her words, Emily Carson came running from town, Abigail Wright close behind her. The doctor immediately began assessing the wounded, her face professionally neutral as she moved among friend and foe alike. "Thomas!" Emily embraced the rancher fiercely, then turned to Martha with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Wilkins, or should I say, Martha will do," she said quietly. "Deadeye Mary was a stage name I left behind long ago, though it seems some debts followed me regardless." She surveyed the battlefield with professional assessment. The Blackwell gang was thoroughly broken. Those not wounded or captured had fled into the hills. More importantly, they'd been broken in a way that would spread her message across the territories. Deadeye Mary might have retired, but she was far from powerless. "What happens now?" Abigail asked as she bandaged James Blackwell's shoulder. "Once word spreads, now," Martha said thoughtfully, "we prepare. Some will come seeking revenge, others looking to make a name for themselves, but they'll find more than just a legend waiting for them." She gestured to the town's defenders who were helping secure the prisoners. They'll find a community that knows how to protect its own, that understands strength isn't just about guns and violence. It's about standing together, about knowing what's worth fighting for. And you, Emily asked softly, will you stay? Martha touched the blue neckerchief at her throat, feeling the weight of both her identities settling into something new. Deadeye Mary found fame here. Martha Wilkins found peace. Perhaps it's time to be both and neither. Looking toward her inn, still standing proud on its hill, she smiled slightly. Besides, I just got that garden replanted. It would be a shame to leave before seeing how the sunflowers bloom. As the sun climbed higher, casting harsh light over the aftermath of battle, Martha began organizing the cleanup with the same efficiency she'd once used to plan exhibitions. But now her skills served a different purpose. Protecting rather than entertaining, building rather than dazzling. The legend of Deadeye Mary would grow with this day's events, but it would be a different kind of legend, not just of a fearsome sharpshooter, but of a woman who found something worth more than fame or glory, a home worth defending, a community worth protecting, and a way to use her skills in service of the light. "Martha!" she called out, noticing the telegraph operator Marcus Fletcher approaching. "Make sure Henderson knows the telegraph lines need to be watched. The Blackwells might have friends with faster horses than brains." She moved through the aftermath with fluid grace, shifting seamlessly between the widow's compassion and the sharpshooter's authority. In doing so, she showed everyone present that sometimes the most powerful force isn't the legend they fear, but the protector they never expected to find. The Blackwell brothers watched silently as they were led away, their grand revenge plot transformed into yet another chapter in Mary Mason's legend. But this chapter would tell a different story, not of an exhibition star's power, but of a defender's wisdom, not of showmanship for profit, but of skill used in service of something greater. "Mrs. Wilkins," Michael called out as she passed, "those stories about you, the ones in the dime novels and around campfires, are any of them true?" Martha paused, looking at the boy thoughtfully. "The true stories, Michael, are rarely the ones that get told. They're written in the choices we make, the people we protect, the principles we refuse to surrender." She smiled gently. "And sometimes they're written in the simple act of serving coffee and pie to good people who need a safe place to rest." The boy nodded, understanding dawning in his young face. He'd sought excitement in tales of the legendary Deadeye Mary, only to find something more valuable in the quiet strength of Martha Wilkins. It was a lesson Martha herself had taken years to learn. True power often lies not in the legend, but in the reality of who we choose to become. Evening settled over Elk Valley like a dusty blanket, bringing with it an uneasy quiet. The day's violence had left its mark, bloodstains in the dust, bullet holes in wooden walls, and most significantly, a profound change in how the town viewed its quiet widow. Martha stood at her inn's window, watching the sunset paint the valley gold, while Abigail Wright tended to the last of the wounded in her makeshift infirmary below. The Blackwell brothers and their surviving men were secured in Henderson's jail, their wounds treated but their spirits broken. More importantly, the IZ story of their defeat was already spreading through whispered conversations and hastily written telegrams. By morning, every outlaw camp and saloon in 3 territories would know Deadeye Mary hadn't gone soft during her retirement, she'd grown more dangerous. "Penny for your thoughts," Abigail's voice carried from the doorway. The doctor's sleeves were rolled up, her hands clean, but her dress spattered with evidence of her day's work. "Just wondering," Martha replied softly. "If I've done these people a disservice, the quiet widow they trusted is gone now. In her place—" She touched the blue neckerchief still at her throat. "In her place stands someone who protected them when it mattered most, Abigail moved to stand beside her friend. Though I have to admit, learning that my favorite coffee companion was once the most celebrated sharpshooter in the country was surprising. Martha's smile held a touch of her old steel. More or less surprising than learning your town doctor was once the personal physician to General Sherman during the March to the Sea. Abigail stiffened. How did you... Deadeye Mary's information network never completely died. Martha's voice held gentle amusement. Besides, your technique for treating gunshot wounds is rather distinctive. The Union Army's battlefield surgeons used to brag about their special methods. A moment of silence passed between them, two women who understood the weight of past lives and secret identities. Then Abigail laughed softly. Well, I suppose we all have our stories. Indeed, Martha's. Attention shifted to movement in the street below. Emily Carson was approaching, Thomas Grant close beside her. The rancher had refused to rest despite his ordeal, insisting on helping tend to the town's defenses. Emily and Thomas found Martha in her kitchen, where she was, of all things, baking pie. The familiar domestic activity seemed incongruous after the day's events, but to Martha it was a deliberate choice, a statement about who she chose to be. Mrs. Wilkins. Thomas's voice carried equal parts awe and uncertainty. We wanted to thank you and to ask if the stories are true about Chicago. Martha continued rolling dough with practiced efficiency. Some are, some aren't. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in between. The reward posters, Emily said quietly. The exhibitions, are they still active? Yes. Martha's hands never paused in their work, though her voice softened. Though most think Mary Mason died in that Chicago fire, it would take someone very brave or very foolish to try collecting now. What happens next? Thomas asked. Will you leave now that people know? Go back to the exhibition circuit? That depends, Martha began, crimping the pie's edge with methodical precision, on whether having a retired sharpshooter as a neighbor troubles you, on whether the town can accept that Martha Wilkins and Deadeye Mary are the same woman. She was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Henderson and Marcus Fletcher. The lawman looked uncomfortable but determined. The telegraph operator just looked amused. Ma'am, Henderson began formally, the town council's been meeting, discussing the situation. Dawn broke over Elk Valley with newfound purpose, painting the landscape in shades of promise. Word of the Blackwell gang's defeat had spread like wildfire through telegraph wires and riders' tales, drawing curious eyes to the once quiet town. But Martha Wilkins, now openly acknowledged as the legendary Deadeye Mary, had anticipated this attention and was already moving to shape it to her advantage. The Whispering Pines Inn had transformed overnight, though the changes were subtle enough that only the most observant would notice. Gun ports disguised as decorative vents, reinforced shutters that looked purely ornamental, carefully positioned mirrors that allowed observation of every approach. The gentle widow's home was becoming a fortress, though it still served the territory's finest coffee and pie. Another rider coming in, Michael called from his new position in the converted attic. Martha had turned it into an observation post, teaching the boy the art of surveillance that had once made her exhibition troupe the most well-informed in the territories. Description? She called back, continuing to knead bread dough with practiced motions. Well-dressed, riding quality horseflesh, gun, low-slung, professional-like. Michael paused, applying the observational skills she'd been teaching him. Something's off about how he carries himself, though. Martha smiled slightly. Marshal's badge under his coat. How did you... Territorial Marshal William Harding, she explained, wiping flour from her hands. He always did have trouble maintaining his undercover posture. Old habits from his cavalry days. Abigail Wright, organizing medical supplies nearby, raised an eyebrow. Friend of yours? We've had our moments, Martha admitted, though the last time we met, I was wearing a very convincing disguise as a traveling journalist, and he was trying to convince me to help trap a notorious counterfeiter. She moved to the window, watching the marshal approach. William Harding was indeed trying to look inconspicuous and failing miserably. 10 years hadn't changed his military bearing or the way his hand stayed too close to his gun. "Michael," she called up, "get word to Henderson, then find Emily. She'll know who needs to make themselves scarce for a while." The boy hurried to comply, understanding the implications. Some of the town's residents had histories they'd rather not explain to a marshal, even one coming to pay respects to the newly revealed exhibition shooter. "Should I be concerned?" Abigail asked quietly. Martha shook her head. "William is a good man in his way. Too honest for his own good sometimes. He's here to understand rather than arrest, though he'll probably feel obligated to make some show of official disapproval." As if on cue, Marshal Harding reined up outside the inn. Martha noted with approval how Michael had already cleared the street, ensuring there would be no innocent bystanders if things went wrong. The boy was learning quickly. "Coffee, Marshal?" she called out before he could dismount. "Or should I say, Major Harding of the 7th Cavalry?" Harding stiffened, then let out a reluctant laugh. "Should have known you'd remember that particular embarrassment. Miss Mason, the uniform suited you," she replied dryly, "though the mustache was a bit much. Come in. We have matters to discuss, and my coffee is better than anything you've had since that cafe in Denver, the one where you left me with the bill while you chased that cattle rustler." "The very same." He gestured to the saddlebags on his horse. "Though in my defense I later sent payment to cover your expenses." "You did," she guided him inside. "Very proper of you. Always a gentleman, William, even when duty took precedence over courtesy." The marshal entered cautiously, taking in the subtle changes to the inn with professional assessment. Martha saw approval in his eyes. He'd always appreciated competence, even in adversaries. "Quite an operation you're setting up here," he observed, accepting a cup of coffee. "Strategic position, clear lines of sight, multiple escape routes. Almost. Like you're expecting trouble." "Trouble tends to find me," Martha replied calmly, "as you well know. The question is, are you here to add to it or to understand why a notorious exhibition shooter chose to become a small town's protector?" Harding sipped his coffee, his eyes widening slightly at the quality. "Bit of both, if I'm honest. The territory's buzzing with news of your reappearance. Got exhibition sponsors worried about broken contracts, bounty hunters checking their old posters, and every young sharpshooter thinking they can make a name by challenging Mary Mason. And what do you think, old friend?" He studied her thoughtfully. "I think you found something worth protecting, something that matters more than applause or prize money. The question is, can you protect it without becoming what you once fled from?" Martha's smile was complex. "That's the real question, isn't it? Mary Mason ruled through spectacle and precision. Martha Wilkins through kindness and trust. Now I need to do something new. Something that combines the best of both." She led him to the window, showing him the town beginning its day. Market. Stalls opening, children playing, life continuing despite the previous day's violence. But now there was a new awareness in how people moved, a quiet confidence in how they carried themselves. "Look there," she pointed. Emily Carson was teaching her suppliers how to pass messages through routine deliveries. Thomas Grant was modifying tools to serve as weapons while still performing their daily tasks. Even Michael was learning to watch and think before acting. They're adapting, Harding realized. Becoming stronger without losing what makes them good. "The best parts," Martha corrected. "The parts about protecting what matters, about using your mind before your trigger finger, about understanding that true strength isn't in how fast you can shoot, but in how many you can save." She turned to face him fully. "So, Marshal, what's it to be? Are you here to try arresting me, to warn me, or to understand that sometimes the law needs help from unexpected quarters?" Harding sat down his coffee cup with deliberate care. Truth is, I'm here because things are changing in the territories. Railroads coming, bringing new money, new corruption. Got reports of organized gangs moving in, making alliances with corrupt officials. The old ways of keeping order aren't enough anymore. You need someone who understands both sides of the law, Martha finished for him. Someone who can fight fire with fire without burning down everything worth saving. The thought had occurred. He smiled slightly. Though I admit finding out the notorious Deadeye Mary was hiding in plain sight as a respectable widow. That was unexpected. Life is full of surprises, William. Martha poured more coffee. Like discovering a territorial marshal has been quietly helping certain fugitives escape custody, ones who were more victim than criminal. Harding stiffened. How did you— I told you my information network never completely died. She smiled at his discomfort, just like your conscience never completely surrendered to the badge. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Henderson, who entered with the careful precision of a man unsure of his welcome in a delicate situation. Marshal, Henderson nodded. Mrs. Wilkins, thought you should know. Rider coming in from the east. Looks like Thomas Grant's foreman with news. Martha's smile was predatory. Right on schedule. Michael already spotted him. 3 riders approached. The south boundary an hour ago, she continued, anticipating Henderson's next report. They're watching the town, trying to gauge our strength after yesterday's fight. They'll report back to whoever hired them, likely one of the Blackwells. Allies from the Carter gang. The 2 lawmen stared at her, and she shrugged. Old habits. I used to have to know everything happening within 50 miles of my exhibition grounds. Too many rivals looking to sabotage equipment or poach performers. She gestured to the smoothly operating defensive system she'd put in place. Notice, William, no panic, no obvious preparations. The town appears peaceful, open, but every approach is covered, every potential threat accounted for. Just like in the old days, he observed, dryly. But now protecting rather than entertaining. Using experience, she corrected. Mary Mason knew how rivals think, how they plan. Martha Wilkins learned how communities survive together. She gestured to the town's response. Together, they create something new. The foreman from Grant's ranch arrived, dusty and tired. His report confirmed Martha's predictions. Strangers asking questions about yesterday's fight, testing boundaries, gauging strength. Were they wearing badges? Harding asked suddenly. Not official ones, the foreman replied, though one claimed to be from the Pinkerton agency. Martha and Harding exchanged glances. Bounty hunters, they said simultaneously. The exhibition companies, Martha continued. They'll be trying to establish whether I'm really Deadeye Mary or just someone with similar skills. They had substantial investment in me, custom equipment, advance bookings, merchandise. That contract you broke, Harding nodded. Colt's exhibition company claimed damages of over $20,000. The same company that hired my manager to cut corners on safety. Her voice hardened. The one whose negligence cost 7 lives. They still have legal standing, he warned. Let them come, she replied simply. I've kept meticulous records. Evidence of their culpability, witness statements, financial papers showing how they profited from endangering audiences. I was preparing a case before. She paused. Before circumstances forced me to disappear. Harding studied her with new respect. You weren't just running. I was regrouping, she corrected. The Chicago fire just gave me the opportunity to do it more thoroughly than planned. Henderson looked between them, confused but adapting quickly. So these Pinkerton men, they're a threat? Not immediately, Martha assured him. First, they need to confirm my identity. Then they'll try legal channels, likely a civil suit to recover damages. Only when that fails will they attempt something more direct. How can you be so sure? Martha's smile was knowing. Because I would have planned it that way myself. Start legitimate, establish legal standing, then escalate when necessary. It's what any professional would do. Harding nodded his agreement. She's right. We have time to prepare a response. We. Martha raised an eyebrow. The marshal straightened, his face resolute. Miss Mason, or Mrs. Wilkins if you prefer, I came here expecting to find a fugitive hiding from justice. Instead, I found a community, being transformed by someone who understands what the frontier truly needs. That's worth supporting, officially or otherwise. Henderson cleared his throat. Meaning? Meaning, Harding explained. I'm granting Mrs. Wilkins special deputy status under territorial jurisdiction. Limited, of course, and provisional upon good behavior. Deputy status? Martha couldn't help but laugh. William, I've spent most of my adult life avoiding lawmen, not joining them. Times change, he replied simply, and so do people. The territory needs someone who can see both sides of a situation, who understands that justice isn't always found in a law book. Martha considered this unexpected development. There was a certain irony in becoming a representative of the law she'd spent years circumventing. Yet it also offered protection, legitimacy that could shield Elk Valley from those who might seek to exploit it. Very well, she said finally, but on my terms. No uniform, no official announcements. I work through Henderson, not directly under territorial authority. Agreed, Harding nodded. Though you'll need to file regular reports. Written, she countered. No appearances at the territorial office. Acceptable, he conceded. And in return, you'll have access to official resources, information, legal standing, reinforcements when necessary. The bargain struck. They moved to practical matters. Martha outlined her assessment of the town's vulnerabilities, the changes needed to its defenses, and the intelligence she'd already gathered about the surrounding territories. Harding contributed his own knowledge of official concerns, creating a comprehensive picture of the challenges they faced. Henderson watched this exchange with growing appreciation. What had begun as a confrontation had transformed into a strategic partnership that could benefit them all. It was yet another example of Martha's skill at turning potential adversaries into allies. As they finished their planning, Emily Carson arrived with news from town. Michael spotted more riders approaching from the north. Not threatening, looks like travelers, but they're asking specifically for Deadeye Mary. Martha nodded, unsurprised. It begins. The curious, the admirers, the challengers, they'll all come now. Thomas, I need you to organize lodging for genuine travelers. Emily, your general store needs to prepare for increased business. Marshall, your presence would be helpful in discouraging the more troublesome visitors. They moved to their assigned tasks with an efficiency that spoke of growing trust and coordination. Within an hour, Elk Valley had transformed from a town bracing for attack to one preparing to capitalize on sudden fame, all while maintaining the vigilance Martha had instilled. The first visitors were indeed harmless enough. A journalist from Denver seeking an interview, a family who had seen her exhibition years ago and wanted autographs for their children, a competing sharpshooter who claimed to have developed a new technique inspired by her famous split-bullet trick. Martha handled them all with grace, granting the interview but controlling the narrative, signing autographs with genuine warmth and diplomatically declining the sharpshooter's challenge while offering technical advice that left him beaming with pride. "You're good at this," Harding observed, watching her manage the growing crowd. "The diplomacy, the redirection. I'd forgotten how much of your exhibition work was about handling people, not just targets." "The shooting was always the easy part," she admitted. "Making people feel special, important. That was the real skill my father taught me, and it transfers remarkably well to community defense." As the day progressed, Martha found herself inhabiting a curious middle ground between her identities. She wasn't fully the famous Deadeye Mary. Her responses were more measured, her demeanor less flamboyant than in her exhibition days. Yet she wasn't wholly the Widow Wilkins either. There was a confidence in her stance, a precision in her movements that belonged to her performing years. Instead, she was becoming something new, a leader who combined showmanship with substance, who understood both the value of a well-placed shot and a well-timed word. The town responded to this evolution, unconsciously aligning itself with her example. By evening, as the visitors departed and Elk Valley settled into its new reality, Martha gathered her core group once more. Michael, Emily, Thomas, Abigail, Henderson, and now Harding. They represented the diverse elements she hoped to unite in defense of their community. Today was just the beginning, she told them, her voice calm but resolute. Tomorrow will bring more visitors, some friendly, some not. We need to be ready for both. What about the Blackwell trial? Thomas asked. When does that happen? The territorial court convenes in 3 weeks, Harding answered. They'll be held in the county jail until then, with extra guards I've personally selected. And the exhibition companies? Abigail pressed. Their legal claims. I've telegraphed my attorney in Chicago, Martha replied. He's preparing countersuits based on the evidence I've preserved. It will take time to resolve, but we'll manage. Meanwhile, Henderson added, we've got a town to run and protect. Those bounty hunters won't be the last to test our boundaries. Martha nodded, pleased with their understanding, which is why we need to use this temporary fame to our advantage. Every visitor is both an opportunity and a potential threat. They bring money, information, and connections that can strengthen us if we're careful. She outlined her strategy for the coming weeks: controlled access to the town, selective hospitality, information gathering from all visitors, and subtle demonstrations of strength to discourage troublemakers. You're turning defense into prosperity, Emily realized, using your reputation to build the town rather than just protect it. Exactly, Martha smiled approvingly. What good is security if there's nothing worth securing? Elk Valley deserves more than just survival. It deserves to thrive. As night fell, the last visitors departed, and Martha stood once more on her porch, watching the stars emerge over the valley. Beside her, somewhat to her surprise, stood Marshal Harding. "Penny for your thoughts, William," she said softly. "Just remembering the first time I saw your exhibition," he replied. "Kansas City, 72. You shot a playing card edge on at 50 paces, then split the halves before they hit the ground. One of my simpler tricks," she acknowledged, "though it took 3 months of practice to perfect. It wasn't the shot that impressed me," he continued. "It was what you said afterward, about how precision could overcome brute force, how in the New West the future belonged to those who combined skill with discipline." Martha smiled slightly. "I believed that once." "And now?" She gestured to the town, peaceful under the evening sky, but vigilant in ways invisible to casual observers. "Now, I believe it takes more than individual skill. It takes community, connection, common purpose. The lone sharpshooter might amaze a crowd, but it's people working together who build something lasting." Harding nodded thoughtfully. "That's worth defending, Mary, worth building a new kind of law around. A new kind of life," she corrected gently. "One where Martha Wilkins and Deadeye Mary both have something to contribute." As the marshal took his leave, Martha returned to her kitchen, where Michael was waiting with questions about tomorrow's plans. She found herself teaching him not just about shooting and strategy, but about the philosophy that had guided her through both her lives: the value of precision over power, preparation over impulse, and protection over glory. In the boy's eager face, she saw the future of Elk Valley. Not a settlement cowering in fear of the next attack, but a community standing proud, combining the sharpshooter's skill with the widow's wisdom to create something stronger than either alone could produce. The real trick, she told him as she prepared for the next day's challenges, isn't hitting the target everyone sees. It's spotting the targets nobody else notices, the opportunities hidden within threats, the strengths disguised as weaknesses. A lesson, she reflected, that both Deadeye Mary and Martha Wilkins had learned through very different paths, and one that their unified self would now teach to a town ready to redefine itself under her protection. 3 months after the Blackwell gang's defeat, Elk Valley had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The Whispering Pines Inn stood as it always had, offering rest and refreshment to weary travelers. But now it served another purpose, a symbol of the town's unique approach to frontier justice. Martha Wilkins, seated on her porch in the gentle afternoon light, watched a group of children practicing at the new shooting range Thomas Grant had built behind the schoolhouse. Their instructor, Michael Carson, had proven himself an able teacher, combining the technical precision Martha had taught him with a natural gift for explaining complex concepts in simple terms. "Not bad," Marshall Harding commented, joining her. With a cup of coffee, he'd taken to visiting Elk Valley regularly, ostensibly for official business, but more often to enjoy the town's peaceful atmosphere and Martha's unparalleled coffee. "The boy's got your eye for spotting talent, and his father's patience," Martha agreed. "Harold would be proud of him." In the months since her true identity had been revealed, Martha had found a curious peace in the integration of her two lives. No longer forced to hide her skills or her past, she'd discovered that Deadeye Mary's precision and Martha Wilkins's compassion created something more powerful than either alone. A protector who could nurture what was good while standing firmly against what threatened it. The Blackwell brothers' trial had concluded 2 weeks earlier, with Judge Franklin Mills ensuring they would never again threaten innocent lives. But more importantly, their defeat had sent a message across the territories. Elk Valley was under the protection of someone who combined the widow's wisdom with the sharpshooter's deadly accuracy. "Letter came for you," Harding said, handing her an official-looking envelope, "from the circuit court in Chicago." Martha opened it calmly, reading the formal legal language with practiced ease. "The exhibition companies have dropped their claims," she announced, her voice neutral, though her eyes betrayed satisfaction. "My counter-evidence regarding their negligence in the Chicago fire was persuasive, meaning they realized pursuing you would open them to far greater liability," Harding translated with a smile. "Something like that." She folded the letter carefully. "Their attorneys have agreed to a settlement that includes surrendering all rights to my performance techniques and public persona in exchange for my silence regarding their safety violations." It was the final legal thread binding her to her past, now neatly severed. Martha felt a curious lightness, as if a weight she'd carried for 10 years had finally been lifted. "Does this change your plans?" Harding asked, studying her carefully. "No," she replied without hesitation. Deadeye Mary belonged to the exhibition circuit. She served her purpose. What I'm building here is something different, something that combines spectacle with substance, protection with prosperity. Below them, Elk Valley bustled with activity. Emily Carson's general store had expanded to include a second building, serving the increased traffic the town now enjoyed. The Prescott Hotel had opened last month, accommodating visitors drawn by the town's growing reputation as both a safe haven and a center for marksmanship training. Martha's informal shooting classes had evolved into the Elk Valley Precision Academy, where ranchers, lawmen, and ordinary citizens could learn not just accuracy with firearms, but the discipline and judgment that made skill meaningful. The waiting list stretched months into the future, with applications coming from as far away as Kansas City. "Speaking of changes," Harding said, pointing to a dust cloud approaching from the east, Looks like your newest student has arrived. Through her field glasses, Martha observed the approaching rider. A young woman, riding with the confident posture of someone comfortable in the saddle, but with the slight stiffness that suggested formal Eastern education. Miss Caroline Whitfield, she identified, daughter of Senator Whitfield from Massachusetts, claims she wants to learn shooting for scholarly purposes, though her letters suggest a young woman looking to escape the confines of Boston society. You planning to accept her? Harding asked, knowing Martha personally reviewed every application to her academy. I am, Martha replied, surprising him slightly. She reminds me of myself at that age. Too much energy for the world she was born into. Too much intelligence to accept the limitations others would place on her. Besides, she smiled slightly, her father's position on the Railroad Commission could prove useful in our efforts to ensure the coming railroad benefits Elk Valley rather than exploits it. This was another aspect of Martha's new role. Strategic. Alliances built not through gunfire, but through the careful cultivation of relationships. Under her guidance, Elk Valley had positioned itself as an essential stop on the proposed rail line, offering security and services that made it valuable to the railroad's interests. Mrs. Wilkins, Michael called from the street, interrupting their conversation. Riders coming in from the south, 8 men, heavily armed. Thomas is organizing the defense positions. Martha rose smoothly, but without alarm. The town's warning system had spotted the approaching group miles ago, giving them ample time to prepare. Since the Blackwell incident, Elk Valley had developed a sophisticated approach to potential threats. No panic, no obvious militarization, but a quiet readiness that permeated every aspect of town life. I believe that would be Mr. Sullivan and his associates, she said calmly. They'd been watching the town for 3 days, gathering information before making their approach. Bounty hunters, Harding asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. Former exhibition shooters, Martha corrected, competitors from my circuit days. Their leader, James Sullivan, once challenged me to a match in St. Louis, lost rather publicly. And now he's back for revenge. Martha's smile held a touch of her old showmanship. Now he's back because he needs help. His exhibition has been losing ground to newer entertainments. He wants to revive interest by associating with the legendary Deadeye Mary, who mysteriously returned from the dead. How could you possibly know that? Harding shook his head in amazement. Because I would have done the same in his position, she replied simply. And because Emily's cousin works for the newspaper in Denver, where Sullivan gave an interview hinting at our historic reunion. She sent us the clipping last week. This, too, was part of Martha's new approach, information flowing into Elk Valley through an intricate network of connections she'd developed. Former exhibition colleagues, grateful travelers, relatives of townspeople, all became sources in a web that kept her apprised of developments that might affect their community. As Sullivan's group entered town, Martha noted their positioning, the quality of their equipment, the way they carried themselves. Professional showmen, not killers, though certainly capable with their weapons. They made a striking picture as they rode down Main Street, colorful costumes, polished firearms, the practiced smiles of men accustomed to performing for audiences. Quite the entrance, Harding observed dryly. Exhibitions are as much about appearance as ability, Martha replied. Something I haven't forgotten, though my purposes have changed. She remained seated on her porch as Sullivan dismounted before the inn, removing his hat with a flourish worthy of a stage performance. Mary Mason, he called out, his voice carrying the practiced projection of a showman. Or should I say, Mrs. Wilkins? It's been many years. Mr. Sullivan, she acknowledged calmly, your entrance is as theatrical as ever. Coffee? He blinked, clearly thrown by her casual response. In his rehearsed scenario, she had likely either challenged him outright or reacted with alarm. Her simple, Hospitality disrupted his performance before it could begin. Yes, thank you, he recovered, gesturing to his men to stay mounted. It seems the reports of your retirement were greatly exaggerated. Martha poured coffee with the same graceful efficiency she'd always shown, nothing in her manner betraying. The precise calculations running through her mind, angles of fire, positions of Sullivan's men, the locations of Henderson's deputies strategically placed around the street. Not exaggerated, she corrected gently. Simply evolving. The Deadeye Mary, who dazzled audiences with impossible shots, has indeed retired. In her place stands someone with different priorities. Sullivan studied her, trying to reconcile the legendary sharpshooter he'd known with this composed woman serving coffee on a frontier porch. They say you took down the Blackwell gang single-handed, that you can still split a playing card at 50 paces. People say many things, she replied evenly, some truer than others. The conversation that followed was a delicate dance, with Sullivan gradually revealing his true purpose, a proposition for Martha to make guest appearances with his struggling exhibition, lending her legendary name to revive his fortunes. He offered substantial payment, creative control, and limited engagement. Martha listened patiently, allowing him to present his case fully before responding. An interesting offer, James. But my place is here now. Elk Valley needs what I can. Provide more than the exhibition circuit does. And what exactly is that? He asked, genuine curiosity breaking through his performer's facade. Martha gestured to the town around them, to Michael teaching children responsible marksmanship, to Emily's thriving business, to the peaceful cooperation that had replaced the fear once governing frontier life. Balance, she said simply. The knowledge that protection doesn't require brutality, that skill doesn't demand showmanship, that a community standing together is stronger than any individual talent. Sullivan's disappointment was evident, but so was his grudging respect. You've changed, Mary. We all do, James. The question is whether we change by choice or by circumstance. She studied him thoughtfully. Your exhibition could change too. There's a place for entertainment that educates, that shows people the value of precision over power, discipline over impulse. The same philosophy you used to espouse, he recalled. Because it remains true, she confirmed, perhaps more relevant now than ever, with the territories changing so rapidly. As their conversation continued, Sullivan's posture gradually relaxed. What had begun as a performance became a genuine exchange between old colleagues. Martha found herself offering suggestions for revitalizing his exhibition, ways to adapt to changing audience tastes while maintaining the core values that had once made such shows meaningful. By the time Sullivan and his troupe departed that evening, they did so not as disappointed rivals, but as renewed allies. Martha had declined his offer to return to the circuit, but had agreed to a limited endorsement that would benefit them both. Sullivan's exhibition would advertise its connection to the principles of Deadeye Mary's precision school, while sending promising students to her academy for advanced training. Nicely handled, Harding commented after they'd gone. You turned a potential confrontation into a mutually beneficial arrangement. The best victories don't require a single shot fired, Martha replied. Another lesson I've learned over the years. As the sun set over Elk Valley, casting long shadows, across the main street, Martha gathered with her inner circle at the inn, Abigail, Henderson, Emily, Thomas, Michael and Marshall Harding. What had once been informal strategy sessions had evolved into a proper town council, with Martha serving not as its official head, but as its guiding conscience. Sullivan's visit is just the beginning, she told them. As word spreads about what we're building here, others will come, some seeking to learn, some to challenge, some to exploit. Let them come, Michael said with the confidence of youth tempered by recent experience. We're ready. Martha smiled at his enthusiasm, so reminiscent of her own younger days, but now channeled toward protection rather than fame. Ready, yes, but also responsive. What makes Elk Valley special isn't just our ability to defend ourselves, it's our understanding of when force is necessary and when wisdom is stronger. Speaking of which, Thomas added, the railroad representatives are due next week. They're still pushing for that right-of-way that would cut through the Carson property. We'll handle them, Martha assured him. Emily's research on alternative routes, combined with Abigail's documentation of water rights, gives us substantial leverage. And if that fails, her eyes twinkled, I might need to demonstrate my famous playing card trick for their benefit. Laughter rippled around the table, but there was a strategic purpose behind her jest. Martha had found that her reputation often accomplished what direct confrontation could not. The mere possibility that Deadeye Mary might oppose a plan was enough to make many reconsider their positions. As night settled over the town, their meeting evolved from strategy into celebration. 3 months of peace, of growth, of finding a balance between vigilance and openness deserved acknowledgement. Abigail produced a bottle of fine brandy. Henderson contributed cigars. Emily unveiled a cake she'd been secretly preparing. A toast, Harding proposed, raising his glass, to Elk Valley, where a harassed widow transformed a town and a town transformed a legend in return. To integration, Martha added softly, of past and present, skill and wisdom, protection and prosperity. As glasses clinked and conversation flowed, Martha found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 10 years ago, fleeing the tragedy of Chicago, she'd sought only anonymity, a quiet place to hide from both her fame and her guilt. She'd found instead a community that needed what both sides of her nature could provide. Martha Wilkins's compassion and Deadeye Mary's precision unified into something greater than either alone. Later, after her friends had departed, Martha stood at her window, watching the moonlight silver the valley that had become her true home. Behind her, the inn that had been her refuge now stood as a symbol of the new life she'd built, a life that honored both her identities while transcending their limitations. A soft knock at her door revealed Michael, his young face serious despite the late hour. Mrs. Wilkins, I've been thinking about what you said about balance and integration. Come in, she welcomed him. What's on your mind? My father, he said quietly. When he took me to see your exhibition, he told me something I didn't understand until now. He said, remember, son, the real magic isn't in hitting the target. It's in knowing which target matters. Martha smiled gently. Harold was a wise man. I think he saw in you what the town sees now, Michael continued. Not just skill, but purpose. Not just accuracy, but direction. He hesitated. I want to thank you, not just for teaching me to shoot, but for showing me why it matters. The why always matters more than the how, Martha replied, touched by his insight. Skills without values are just techniques waiting to be misused. After Michael left, Martha returned to her window, feeling a completeness she'd long thought beyond her reach. Deadeye Mary had dazzled crowds with seemingly impossible feats. Martha Wilkins had nurtured a community with quiet strength. Now, the woman she'd become, neither fully one nor fully the other, had found her true purpose in guiding a town that embodied the best qualities of both her lives. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the railroad negotiations, Miss Whitfield's training, Sullivan's evolving partnership, and doubtless some unexpected crisis requiring both quick reflexes and careful thought. But for the first time in many years, Martha faced the future with neither the performer's need to dazzle nor the fugitive's need to hide. Instead, she stood as herself, complete and integrated, a woman who had learned that the most powerful Shot is the one that protects rather than destroys, that builds rather than diminishes. The famous blue neckerchief now hung framed in her parlor, not as a relic of the past, but as a reminder of the journey that had brought her home. Outside, Elk Valley slept peacefully under the stars, its citizens secure in the knowledge that their town was protected by something more reliable than mere firepower. A community united in purpose, guided by a woman who had mastered the rarest skill of all, the ability to transform tragedy into wisdom, conflict into harmony, and separate identities into a unified whole greater than its parts. Martha Wilkins, once the legendary Deadeye Mary, touched the silver brooch at her collar and smiled into the darkness. The Cowboys, who had harassed a widow, ignorant of her sharpshooting past, had inadvertently triggered not just a personal transformation, but a community renaissance. Some mistakes, she reflected, turn out to be blessings in disguise, particularly when they reveal that what seemed like an ending is merely the beginning of a far more meaningful chapter. And as Elk Valley grew stronger under her guidance, that chapter promised to be the most remarkable of all, not because of targets hit, but because lives transformed. The legacy of Deadeye Mary would indeed live on, not in exhibition posters or dime novels, but in a town that had learned her most important lesson. True precision isn't about splitting playing cards or shooting between flames, but about finding the exact point where skill and compassion, strength and mercy, past and future, could unite to create something truly extraordinary. A lesson, Martha thought as she finally turned from the window toward rest, worth every step of the journey that had brought her home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.